Hello, everybody. My name is Ian Kirkpatrick. I'm an author, idiot, and loin streamer, and today we're going to be talking about Gretchen Felker-Martin's new book, Cuckoo. In case you are not familiar with Gretchen Felker-Martin, they are the author of the book Manhunt, which came out a couple of years ago now, and that is the book about a couple of trans women that are living in the zombie apocalypse where men with too much testosterone have turned into raping monsters, and the trans women have to continually hunt down the men in order to drink the estrogen out of their ball sacks so that they don't become rapist zombies as well. Because once your T gets too high, you turn. So the main bad guys in that are obviously the TERFs. So this is different from that. This author is also famously known for saying that horror needs more rape in it and that children should be exposed to kink. So that's your basic introduction to Gretchen Felker-Martin. This person also expresses themselves to be a transgender woman and is a darling of the horror industry, horror book community. So you don't really see a whole lot of criticisms go around for this person. It's kind of amazing. But before we get started, number one, if you enjoy what I do here on the channel, please remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Number two, if you would like to be featured on the channel, check out the links down in the description below. The number one way to be featured is through Lamwai, the monthly prompt writing contest, where I give you a prompt, you write a short story using that prompt, and on the first Monday video of the month, we bask in your creativity. The second way to be featured is if you are an indie author and you have a book out or a book that is coming out. If you submit it to the Fresh Meat feature, the first chapter will be right here on the channel to hopefully help more readers find your work, because that is the hardest thing once the book is out in the world, just standing out somehow. And the third thing is, if you would like to check out any of my books, judge me, to each their own. You can get them at any of your favorite places to get books, including the local library upon request. My newest book, Body More Zero, is coming out in October, featuring these gentlemen right here. Art by the wonderful Morris, and her contact information is down below because sometimes she does commissions. With that said, let's jump into the book review. So looking at the reviews, this book is constantly compared to Stephen King, not just by Publishers Weekly, not just by some of the magazines that are obviously trying to beef up the sales on this, but by a lot of the reviewers. And of course, people tend to over-exaggerate when doing comp titles in order to elevate their fiction. But I had a really hard time seeing how this was anything like Stephen King's It beyond some of the most cosmetic manners, like a group of teenagers being sent away somewhere or being somewhere, then separating and then coming back to defeat the monster at the end, which there is no buildup. This whole thing is so stupid. It didn't have enough time to do what it was trying to do, because it was also trying to do it with too many characters that it also didn't care about. But we'll get there. You'll have to let me know, but we'll get there. As we go forward, I'm not as familiar with Stephen King's actual book, but I did have a Stephen King aficionado with me as I was reading this to help pick out some things. But I will be looking forward to your thoughts on the comparisons and what they have in common, if not. But I do think that this book has much more in common with the Stepford Wives and with Body Snatchers than it does with Stephen King's It. Also, the way that they solve this at the end, freaking garbage trash. Do not be surprised if I start getting more irritated as we go through the story, because it is such boo-boo trash. But before we get into the actual synopsis of what happens in the story, let me tell you what the Goodreads synopsis says, because I don't think it's accurate. In the late 90s, 5 queer kids whose parents want them fixed find themselves thrown together at a secretive, tough love camp deep in the scorching Utah desert. Tormented and worked to the point of collapse by hardline religious zealots intent on straightening them out, they slowly become aware that something in the mountains north of the camp is speaking to them in their dreams, and that the children who return home to their families have changed. That sounds mildly more promising than the book that we got. I'm going to be honest with you. There are more than 5 perspectives, and depending on which website you go to, it'll actually say 7 versus 5. You don't really get religious zealots from this camp, at all. There are no Bible classes. Nobody actually has a Bible. They never even utter the word Bible at the Bible camp. The word Bible is used 4 times in the entire book, and none of them are at the camp. There is no disciplining. There's no actual conversion therapy going on. There's no exposure to different things. There's no actually disciplining them for their interests. It's literally just a labor camp is actually closer to what it is. Also, funny to say, the children's use Jesus's name more than any of the adults at the camp because the adults at the camp never actually evoke the name of Christ. The children, though, constantly say it say it the most throughout the book in exclamation. So, I don't know why this author chose to do a conversion therapy camp other than to try to be trendy, because there were a couple of different conversion therapy books that came out at the same time, and Chuck Tingle did one too. So it might be an astroturfing in the traditionally published industry, but it's a weird thing. And especially when you don't actually include any elements of Christianity or religious zealots or Bible verses or anything. At that point, because it references religious zealotry but doesn't do anything in the story, it just makes me think that the author wanted to dunk on Christianity of some kind, but also didn't care enough about it to investigate it, to actually study any of it enough to put it in the book. So they just used the generic idea of it and built nothing into the story for it. Because, I mean, effort? What kind of loser puts effort into the story or the setting that they're writing, especially when you've got a guaranteed publication deal for whatever reason this is? For the most part, they just have the kids running around, carrying tires and digging holes. Somehow they think making the girls peel potatoes and cook in the kitchen is going to make them less gay. Fact check, lesbians. Didn't know lesbians know how to cook. Is that why that happened? It's not me, it's this book. Prepare yourselves for the spicy opinions incoming as we go. If you want to be offended, then this video isn't going to be for you. I'm going to be talking about the book. I'm going to be asking some tough questions, and I'm going to be asking some questions that certain people in certain ideologies may not like me asking, because I'm going to be talking about this book and the way that Gretchen has expressed things in their book. One final side note before we get into the actual synopsis. So you see that on the cover, there are a bunch of eggs, there are a bunch of cracked eggs, and then there is one non-cracked egg. Do you think that this and the cuckoo were specifically chosen because in trans vernacular, and specifically what I've noticed is in trans woman vernacular, cracking the egg is coming out as trans or realizing that you're trans or determining that you're trans? And so do you think that this cover and this choice was made specifically as a reference to cracking the egg? Now that that's all settled, getting into the beginning of the book, which I would call it a prologue because it starts before the start of the series, or it starts before the book with a character that's never going to come up again. You would think it would have been a great decision to make this character be somebody that shows up later, maybe as a camp counselor, maybe as somebody that the kids run into, but no, Cassie never comes up again. Anyway, we're going to get into this. 1991, the section is called The Good News, and we open with a religious excessively cleaning as a coping mechanism after she sent her daughter away to conversion camp to help her stop being a lesbian. It seems that she wasn't entirely sure if she should do this, but she feels like she needed to do it because of her background, as she continually just frantically cleans and obsesses as time goes by. Monica is married to this husband named Wayne, and he has two sons, Brian and Steve, both younger than their daughter Casey, who is 16 going on 17. The husband is totally useless, generally a stereotype, playing cards with the bros and his son while she does the dishes on all of the house cleaning, getting a lot of Grady Hendrix vibes from housewifery here. We got Pastor Daniel saying that Casey's sexuality was, quote, a phase, just a phase that some girls go through, a dirty, nasty little phase brought on by MTV and communism, free love, and grass and tribadists hunting locker rooms all over the country. Many pages are spent cleaning and obsessing if Monica did the right thing, and she has nightmares about her daughter that include, quote, Casey kicked by other girls behind the school until her mouth and anus bled. Night after night, she woke soaked in sweat hours before dawn and polished silverware, dusted shelves until it was time to pack lunches for Wayne and the boys and then to make breakfast. And it made me think of Patty so bad. Did none of these women have I just sat down to do a puzzle to try to cool my mind. I sat down to do a crossword puzzle to try to cool my mind. Now they just obsessively clean silverware. They have no hobbies, no personality, no nothing outside of strict house cleanery. That's how you keep them on the straight and narrow. As soon as your women get hobbies, you know they're going to the lesbianism. Eventually, it brings back the daughter, who is now a perfect little angel, saying that she was mistaken about things and that she is currently fitting into gender roles, being passive, helping her mom do dishes without complaint, and in the middle of the night, she is found praying in the basement. Monica is more alarmed than anything, wondering what's going on with her daughter, as it feels like she isn't herself anymore. Oh yeah, and Monica also doesn't like that her daughter now refers to her father as daddy, and finds that very weird since Casey never called her father daddy. After finding her praying, Monica asks her about what camp was like, and she says, "For you and Daddy and Brian and Steve, and for the pastor Eddie and Mrs. Glover, everyone at camp, so many of them, all still fighting for themselves, for their souls." "What was it like?" said Monica. "It was hard. Meredith, Miss Glover, told us that it's like suicide to change who you are, that most people are too afraid to ever admit that they might be wrong." Her eyes glistened in the faint, flickering light of the overhead as she stepped out from under the stairs. "I didn't want to believe her. I was so angry at you and Daddy." Daddy. It was like that was all that I could feel. Even in the session with Pastor Eddie, when we were talking about, the things that I did and why I did them, I was so angry that I could hardly sleep. I was so angry. And then one day, a few weeks ago, I was scrubbing the floor of the farmhouse, cleaning. And it's just like fell away. I felt this light in my chest, this white fire, and all of the anger was gone. I opened a box and I put my daughter inside of it. "That's very good," said Monica, not knowing what else to say, not knowing why suspicion still gnawed at the pit of her stomach. That's good, Casey." Casey leaned her head against Monica's shoulder. "I love you, Mom," she whispered. Monica's skin crawled. We get a summary of a passage of time. Quote, "Days passed, became weeks, then months. Fall blew in over the Rockies. Casey's grades improved. She joined the baking club. Sundays, she volunteered at the church daycare. Monica had looked in on her once or twice, disturbed somehow by the thought of Casey around little children, but they adored her, crawling over her, demanding stories, cuddling in her lap for nap time. Mrs. Henson, the harried, bone-thin woman who ran the daycare, said that Casey was so sweet, so responsible, she felt she hardly had anything left to do herself. By Thanksgiving, Monica had almost grown used to this dutiful, even-tempered new daughter. Casey helped her roll out pie crust, bake biscuits, stuff the turkey, a 20-pound monstrosity from one of Wayne's fishing buddies who had a farm in Gelton, 2 towns over, and lay the table. At church, the pastor mentions how a woman named Carol Ann had died, and Monica learns through the paper that she basically went postal, killing her son and then shooting herself with a shotgun the day after Thanksgiving. Monica's husband is like, "That woman was always crazy." And Monica's like, "No, she wasn't. I knew her for 15 years. She was normal just like us." I'm already getting the vibe that this is leaning into the way that Grady Hendrix demonizes housewifery in his book of vampire slaying. Watching TV, you get, quote, "On the television, Pat Robertson was explaining the ways in which teaching children about evolution made them homosexual." Does that mean that school is state-sponsored homosexuality? Wayne tells Monica to shut up about Carol Ann because he doesn't really care. It's not his problem, and then she starts thinking about what it would be like to get divorced. Quote, "She stared at him for a long time as Robertson continued his tirade. She wondered what it would feel like to ask Wayne for a divorce, if he would laugh at her or hit her or simply nod and say that he'd been meaning to get around to it himself. She would have to find a new congregation. Righteous Hearts was full of Wayne's people, though without her they would soon realize that he wasn't the accounting wizard they believed he was. Marriage is a sacrament," she heard her mother say. She could almost see the ugly purple bruises on Mary Lapel's throat, the cuts and scrapes on the side of her pretty face. "It says in the Bible that wives are to be subject to your husbands." Her mother had put up with much worse than she got from Wayne, and she had been a beauty in her day, too. Monica, with her overbite and stuck-out ears, had never turned heads. So yeah, hitting hard on stereotypes here, as hard as humanly possible, it really seems like. But this is like the most it will ever lean into the Christian thing. I don't think that this prologue actually does justice to what the rest of the book is going to be like. At the funeral for Carol Ann a little bit later, Monica is thinking about how Terry had been sent away to the same camp that Casey had just gone to earlier that year. Across the grave, a boy named Stan Forrester looks broken and sad. He asks if Monica knew. Who is freaking Stan Forrester? We get no explanation of who this kid is, and we can only guess about a page and a half later or more that this is one of the kids to the mom that killed herself. He says that he can't find the mom's diary, the diary for this year, even though they have diaries going back until 82. It feels so randomly inserted to lead up to nothing. And no, this lost diary never comes back. It doesn't mean anything. It's a broken lead, and you would at least think that maybe Monica would find the diary, or maybe one of the kids in the future would find the diary. But again, this entire prologue basically turns into meaning nothing. Monica flees from the scene as she's uncomfortable, and her sons are throwing dirt at each other and roughhousing with other kids out by the parking lot. She yells at them. Her husband catches up and snaps at her for running away from the gravesite without dignity, and she thinks about how strong her husband is, that once he pulled their child's arm out of the socket when he was only 4 years old, when he'd been in Wayne's office. And while at the doctor's office, all she could think about was The Shining and how Jack hadn't meant to hurt him and how he felt awful. She returns to the grave to collect her daughter, and Casey is leaning over the grave, whispering to it, and Monica is overwhelmed with this feeling to shove her in. She alerts her daughter that they're leaving. Casey agrees and follows back to the car. Monica acknowledges that the girl is not her daughter. She then meets with Pastor Daniel about her worries over her daughter, and he tells her that it's normal to not trust your success, but Casey is doing very well and will do well in the future, and she should be happy at her success of converting her daughter. Monica avoids telling the pastor that what Casey has been doing in the basement and the talking to the grave, because she doesn't want to look crazy. Pastor says that she should take a break and rest herself, and she's not surprised that he doesn't believe her, that there might be some schizophrenia or demons involved with her daughter. She says that no one is going to believe her because she's not very likable, and people only believe likable people. Monica is assured by the pastor that things will be fine, and she thanks him. Just in case you weren't sure that the pastor is supposed to be a bad guy, it randomly says, "Psst, he's reading the Turner Diaries," while she leaves. BT dubs. Monica recognizes it as the book that her father read years ago. What a random thing to insert into this book to never come up again. Also, what a random book to have in your office at a church. Monica gets home. Her husband's car is still in the garage, and she thinks that she can smell her husband's snack box in the house. This box she described earlier was one that he keeps candy bars in that she's never touched. She's not allowed to touch. It's his special candy bar box. But here we get, quote, Monica sniffed. That wet, sugary smell hung in the air, the smell of Wayne's box, the smell that had wafted out of Terry Forrester's open grave as Casey knelt beside it, whispering to something. Stan's voice echoed in her memory. "Do you have her diary?" She heard a sound, a faint groan of bed springs coming through the ceiling. The thought that Wayne was having an affair flickered briefly through her mind, but it inspired no real anger. He wasn't interested. He had this box. Sometimes she imagined him fucking it, creasing its corners as he pushed himself against its velvety, ragged cardboard. She imagined it was full of his dried secretions, a milky lake concealed in total darkness, hiding its true purpose. Slowly, she moved toward the stairs. She goes upstairs, goes to her room, and finds her daughter having sex with her husband. Also, tendrils of tissue burst out of Casey's mouth and wrap around Wayne's neck, penetrating every orifice in his face. Monica runs, and the thing follows, catches up. More Grady Hendrix influence here, with attention brought to how much mom is wetting herself. We will also find, as we go through this book, any chance that this author gets to mention urination or pee drinking, Gretchen goes for it. And even if there's no reason to bring it up, Gretchen finds a reason to bring it up. Casey punches Monica in the face, breaks her legs, drags her into the living room, and then consumes her. Quote, her daughter's face opened up like a flower, splitting into fleshy petals lined with jumbled baby teeth and dripping thick, opaque secretions. A wet red mouth gnashed mindlessly. Monica began to laugh as it tore her blouse and bent to seal itself against her breast, its tentacles cutting into her chest and collarbones. Something within the raw, squirming mass of its split face fastening tightly around her nipples, squeezing so hard that her laugh became a scream, a strangled hiss, fingers in her mouth, and that sweet, damp taste on her tongue. And then nothing opened up beneath her, vast and wet and dark, and she fell into it. It kind of sounds like a knockoff of the creature from Stranger Things, but you'll have to tell me. Having finished this, I still don't get how this goes with the cuckoo. At least make it a cuckoo, but then after that, we get into part 1 called Tough Love. Enter Shelby, and she's running around Penn Station crying, thinking about how her two mothers probably have at least one PI sniffing around for her, and they're probably ashamed of her for being the best and most expensive adopted Korean child that they could have gotten, who is now a runaway transvestite. She's trying to find a place to live, passes an old homeless man on the street and gives him $1. Why, when she's poor and 17 or 16, I don't know. While she's wondering if she'll look like that in 20 to 30 years. She can't stay at Charlie's cat house because the pedos will come knocking, and some guy named Tyler seems to be getting bored of her. It sounds like her boyfriend, Tyler. And she knows that he's getting bored of her because the other day when she was sucking him off, he mocked her for being fat and having no ass. She says that Tyler doesn't like to be with her in public, and his friends come and when his friends come over, he makes her leave. Quote, when his college friends come to smoke weed and watch shitty movies, he'd make sure to clear her out an hour beforehand, not to come back until an appointed time. When she did, sunburned and drained, the counters would be sticky, the linoleum dripped with coke, the toilet seat furred with loose pubes stuck in slick urine. I gotta ask, the toilet is furred with pubes and urine? What kind of art project are these guys doing when she's out? Also, she comes back sunburned and drained. Why doesn't she just go to a coffee shop? You're in New York City. There are so many places that you could hang out, and if not a coffee shop, the library. You don't gotta wander around out in the sun until it's time to go home. She says that Tyler throws tantrums if she doesn't clean up the shithole, so she does, because where else would she go? Making this obviously appear as a relationship to her benefit, not because she cares. So while she complains that Tyler is getting bored of her, she's also using Tyler and not emotionally invested in him either. He just gives her a place to stay. So it makes the situation less sympathetic. They're both using each other. She calls herself a parasite, saying that she has nowhere to go. More generic stereotyping, quote, Stell's family had always treated her with a kind of benevolent disgust that she had no reason to suspect that concealed any secret fondness, and Ruth's were all Bible psychos living on a rotting compound somewhere deep in Alabama. They probably didn't even know that she existed. Not that they'd take her in if they did. So Stell and Ruth are her lesbian parents, who are both apparently Bible thumpers, but also the way they are. She travels her way to Tyler's apartment, complaining the whole time and wondering if ghosts from a shooting in 1993 haunt the train station. She hates where Tyler lives, and she hates herself. Quote, each step felt heavier than the last time she climbed towards Tyler's landing. Her thighs were chafed, her dress dark under the arms with sweat, and her cock and balls tucked back between her legs and taped in place. A fetid swamp. You're fat, you're ugly, you reek. One look and anyone could tell that you're not a real woman. He's going to throw you out. That's why Charlie didn't want you, because you're a freak, an ugly freak. Who would pay for that? Shelby gets inside, and there are two men, David and Enoch, with Tyler, and they've been sent to collect her because Shelby's moms are worried. They force her into a van, and in that van, trying to get out, we get, quote, when they hit the highway, their stop-and-start progress smoothing out into a roar of the open road, she began to cry. It started in her throat, a lump that she could hardly swallow past, and then she was sobbing so hard that she nearly retched, her whole body bent over by the force of her misery. No matter how many times Ruth had threatened her with reform school or the cops or wilderness retreats way out in the linty navel of Nebraska, she'd never really believed the hammer would come down. She'd heard of them arguing at night, Snell sniffing and saying, it's just a phase, while Ruth ranted about gender roles and autogynephilia. And somehow, she'd thought that it would blow over, and 10 years later, it would be an ugly memory. I can't help but think about how much this author may or may not hate women, because, again, we've got TERFs, somehow we have lesbian parents that are also the worst parents, that also have something like, it's just a phase, our gay child is just going through trans stuff in a phase, which we'll also learn later that these parents hoped that their child would be gay, but when the child decided to transition, they were like, oh, hell no. They wanted a designer gay baby, though. Considering the TERFs were in the other book, I guess you can't get away from here, but I guess this author wanted to go with the TERF lesbian mothers that were also Bible thumpers. You know, put racism on them too. Did their parents read the Turner Diaries? Let's just load up everything on them, shall we? Anyway, it never explains who Stell and Ruth are in this. You just sort of have to guess, and it's only at this point that you kind of probably guess that Stell and Ruth are Shelby's parents, because before that, you don't really have any context when their names are brought up, and you're like, furthering the vibe of hating women, you get, quote, even the night that she'd left for Tyler's, her great escape, when Ruth cornered her in the kitchen shrieking, "You want to be a woman? You want to be a woman? See how you like it. See if you can take it," and hit her again and again, vicious little slaps across her face, her throat, her chest, and shoulders. She didn't really believe it. It would just end sooner or later, and they would pretend it never happened at all, like they had when Stell caught her trying on Ruth's pantyhose, or the time on the Cape with Julian Donner. Now here it was. She guessed wrong, so unbelievably wrong, and she was going to pay for it. Stopped somewhere, Shelby starts making noises until a dude on the other side mentions a transvestite in the trunk. They open the door and quote, "Fat," said Jimmy once a moment had passed. "Little titties and everything. Could have fooled me, tell you the truth." And Enoch tosses a package of crackers and a bottle of warm Poland Springs into the van and slammed the door again. Shelby felt a flush of perverse pride that she clung to as she unscrewed the bottle with her teeth and choked on the lukewarm water as she tore open the package of smashed peanut butter crackers and ate them like a pig face first, snorting and snuffling. The cab doors slammed and the van pulled away from the plump creaking and thumping back onto the open road, those eyes, nested deep in leathery skin, going wide. Could have fooled me. Something feeling real icky about the focus on the fat piggy oink oink that's going on here all of a sudden in the narration. What is that? Now we switch over to Blossom, Kansas with Nadine. Nadine's headbutting her mom and fighting her sisters as some person is trying to take her away, theoretically, to the conversion camp. Here, the word bodily makes an appearance for bodily lifting Nadine into the air to nab her. She bites the woman's arm and her mouth fills with blood. Quote, "Blood filled Nadine's mouth. She thought of Tessa's pussy, of the deep iron stink of the other girl's period as she pressed her nose into the slit and spat, laughing. A closed fist slammed into her cheek and rocked her head back like a speed bag. She saw stars." Get some help. This will not be the first and only time that we see the reference of period. And that seems to be like all that this author associates femininity with, or being a woman with, because anytime we're in a character's perspective with a female, it's like, oh, forgot to mention. You know the drill. Quote, "Names and dates, retching and gasping, a string of bloody skin swinging loose from her forearm shoved Nadine at the beard, who wrapped her in a crushing bear hug from behind. He twisted her arms behind her back and snapped a cuff on her right wrist. He did it easily, by rote, like tying off a garbage bag or hefting firewood. Names and dates, gray-faced and swaying a little, followed them toward the van. She wrapped a handkerchief around her wounded arm. Nadine kicked, spat, went limp, and finally forced herself to piss, a urine stain darkening the crotch of her overalls, but the beard was unfazed. See, I think that Grady Hendrix would have been a better comp title by a long shot, especially because both Grady and Gretchen seem to lean into trying to do physical body horror style horror. Gretchen just takes it next level into nonsense of trying to be as disgusting as possible, thinking that that means horror. Obviously, since this is an inciting incident, Nadine is going to lose this fight, gets pulled into the car, but also gets her face bashed in twice by Dates and Names person. And the person is called Dates and Names because Nadine doesn't have a name, but the person has a tattoo with Dates and Names on her body. And Nadine is like, I hope those people that you're tattooed on your body, I hope they're freaking dead. I hope they're your dead kids. Then we get to Camp Resolution. Enter Gabe in a bus with a woman being taken to the camp, and he's being talked to about being gay and found with boys and apparently also cross-dressing because he stole girls' clothes at one of the camps that he was found at with a boy. His long brown hair is shaved off, and he's pushed outside, looking at some of the men guarding the place with guns, thinking, quote, the long barrel of the shotgun resting on his shoulder glinted in the sunlight. Gabe had never held a gun in his life, had seldom so much seen one, except for at his uncle's in the fall when the men and the other boys would suit up in camo and reflective neon oranges and go out stomping into the woods to kill things. Switch over to Shelby, now joining the line. Another mention of petals and carnivorous plants of Stranger Things. Everyone is all lined up. All biological males have their hair cut off. Pastor Eddie steps up onto the stage and starts lecturing the kids about what they are there for, and if they don't behave, they're going to get the belt. Quote, you're here because your parents love you. because they don't want to see you sell yourselves on street corners for pills and marijuana. They don't want to see you lying in hospital beds with sores on your faces, legions like the ones God laid on the Egyptians, holding the children of Israel hostage the way that you, he jabbed in a forefinger at them, sweeping it like a scythe, are hostage to the pornographers in Washington and Hollywood and New York City, to the idea that they've planted in your heads, that the lies that they have told. They're all going to be left to deal with themselves, think about themselves tonight, and tomorrow is when the real work gets started. Shelby is out here judging the people around her like, quote, he calmed. The color faded from his sun-roughed cheeks, and behind him, a little doll woman in her chair had a hungry look up on her gaunt, pinched face. Not far from Shelby, a big, fat white boy started crying, sniffling like a baby, and a lanky brown boy with a butch haircut and a little mustache observed the tears with that look of fat disgust. Shelby hugged herself and dug her nails into her forearms. Now they are in the mess hall, eating nasty chili and cornbread, and Gabe is thinking how much he hates skinny girls. Quote, skinny girls made him angry. He didn't understand it, but just the sight of one was enough to make him want to scream. I'm better than you. Their ribs and their knobs of their spines seemed to hiss at him. My every step is effortless, weightless. While you plod on the dirty earth, I soar above you, drenched in sunlight. His mind kept straying back to the woman sitting in the wicker chair on the platform in the pavilion, to the fleshless lines on her skull, the elegance of her long fingers, and the blue traceries of veins visible on her scalp through her hair. Which then leads into, you should eat, said the girl sitting across from him, who was fat and thus, according to the hidden calculus of how Gabe saw the world, safe. They work the boys really hard. He flashed a smile, the most charming that he could drag out of the sweaty, itchy, crop-haired walking skin suit. Fat girls usually liked him. In 8th grade, he'd had a friend named Bia, who'd followed him everywhere like a sad-eyed little puppy, doing his homework and laughing at his jokes with nervous, almost frantic intensity, until finally he'd let her jerk him off in the woods past the playground. After that, the sight of her had made him sick. Made him think of the pearlescent slick of his cum on her soft forearm, the jiggle of her breast as her wrist moved, and the skin of his penis slid up and down with the motion of her palm, exposing its swollen purple head. After they'd parted, he'd thrown up over the roots of an old pine tree not far from the river where the other kids were jumping off Black Moth Rock and hunting for crayfish in the shallows. This girl sitting next to Gabe is named Candace, and she's been here for a week and informs him that they have girls do the housework and boys do the outdoor work, go to etiquette classes and exercise. And he says, quote, that's really unfair, he said, trying his best to sound sympathetic. The thought of her round, heavy body jiggling as she labored through a set of jumping jacks made him feel contemptuous and keenly interested. I bet you're better at it than you think. What did he mean by this? Candace warns Gabe that he should behave because if you don't and you get the belt and it doesn't stop you, then they let the other kids deal with you. Whatever that means. We'll never find out because it doesn't go there. They get locked in their bunk room, and Gabe is with another super fat kid named John, also Shelby, and someone named Brady. Don't get used to Brady because he really doesn't matter. Gabe and Brady won't stop crying. John doesn't say anything, and Shelby just curls into herself and doesn't bother to talk to anyone because everyone's all out of sorts, obviously, for obvious reasons. The next chapter opens with, quote, the desert was endless, and Nadine was digging in it, her undershirt sticking to her sweaty back, her hands blistering where they gripped the shovel shaft. Sometimes it rained, and the rain was thick and viscous and smelled like hairy trench of skin between pussy and butthole, rank and sour and gamey. Her little sister Nina called her butthole sometimes when she was angry. She shouted it like a swear. Butthole, butthole, as though it meant something on its own. The hole Nadine was digging in grew deeper. She could hear Tess's voice somewhere under the hard, dry dirt. That voice. Valley girl with a hint of lisp and those baby blues looking up at her. That soft mouth moaning. Another finger? Like a question. I want your whole fist. I want it, Nate. So, looking at this, what are we, like 16? And if you're already fisting at 16, I'm going to just say that somebody was probably molested as a child or raped as a child, or maybe I'm just naive. But I can't imagine teenagers saying, "Fist me, daddy." So it looks like she was dreaming about digging up a dead dog where it was buried after her dad ran it over, and something creepy happens, and then the girl above her bunk is moving and it pulls Nadine from her dreams. Nadine is thinking about taking on the camp counselor and killing them and then running off, but then she thinks, how is she going to get anywhere? Where is she going to go? How is anybody going to help her when they're in the middle of the desert and there's nowhere around to go? Cheryl, a tiny camp counselor, shorter than all of the other kids, comes in and rips one of the girls out of the bed and then puts her foot to the girl's chest, telling them that they're all ladies and they're going to act like it. Then it's time to go for a run for that morning. Switch over to Felix running around with a bunch of the other kids, thinking about how he was sent off here. Quote, he watched them through scratched sunglasses, his face emotionless. Felix wondered if Enoch had been through this, if he'd put on his mother's nylons or given his boy cousins handies at Christmas and gotten his own white ass shipped off to wherever the fuck this was, Utah or Arizona or wherever, so Pastor Eddie and the rest of his boy band could help pray away the gay. While the girls are running, one of them struggles and collapses and throws up from sickness. The counselor comes over and rubs her face in the vomit, telling her that she's going to be hitched to a car like a doggy and dragged through the street if they miss breakfast. So they keep running. Switch over to the boys running, and they're taunting each other. Then they think about what they might do to kill the guys in charge and escape. They fight with each other and then decide that they just want to get to work so that they don't fight each other right now, because that's just what the baddies want. We open then with a girl named Jo taking a shower and hating the way that the shower is set up at this place, while lusting about all of the other females and female-bodied people, including Felix, who is identified as a female-to-male transsexual. Quote, the water pressure was slack. It drooled over her, tepid and smelling of chemicals, as she palmed the chunk of rock-hard soap from the metal tray nailed to the mess hall's plank siding and started working up a lather. The other girls and the transsexual, Felix, who bunked in her cabin, stepped under the misting fitful spray. He's kind of hot, she thought, wondering if that made her less or more of a lesbian. Tall, strong, like Gomez Adams' mustache. We find out that Jo is Japanese and that her family disagrees with her, except for her uncle who loves her no matter what. She continues lusting after the other girls. Quote, I want to fuck all of you, she thought at the girls around her, a black void opening in the pit of her stomach. In the corner of the stall, the big redhead Betty, who'd hurt Smith during the run, was touching herself under the farthest shower head, the muscles in her broad shoulders flexing and tensing. Another girl, slim and olive-skinned, with a thick black eyebrows and rows of scars on the sides of her skinny thighs, stood on tiptoes next to her, whispering in her ear. Jo's throat felt tight. Her clit was stiff and aching. Please, don't look at me. This was such a bizarre switching of back and forth between exposition and lust posting, and that's like all that happens in this scene before we switch to when the girl leaves the showers and thinks about how she doesn't want to be here. So that's really all that this chapter is. We switch over to John, and all of the other boys are mocking him for being a fatty. His stepmom is apparently in a Weight Watchers group where no one is held accountable for anything because nobody wants to feel bad. His mom died of cancer. He mentions again that she was round, quote, and they all resented her. Poor innocent Sheila, who had married John's dad after cancer, picked his soft round mother's bones clean and flicked the shriveled stick of her away for her self-control and because she'd joined to work on her body fat percentage and not weight. Wasn't that sad? Wasn't it sad? Didn't they all agree that it was sad, sad, sad? The way that those cows just couldn't control themselves and made it everyone else's problem. Seriously, man, did you watch The Blob and think that there's a look that I could pull off? The boys are all shuffling, and then they turn on Shelby as well, and John defends her. The boys go back and apologize to Shelby. The boys back off and apologize, and Shelby says thank you. Over to Nadine after breakfast. The girls are all in the car going somewhere. Nadine's judging the counselor and the teacher's pet. Nadine taunts, and you get, quote, you don't want to fuck with Athena, said Betty. Why not? A shark-like grin. Because that would mean that you were fucking with me, and I'd drag you out of bed some night and drown you in a toilet. All right, said Nadine, wondering if Betty had ever actually killed anyone. She'd known a girl in school when she lived in Texas who had probably had killed her brother and done time in juvie. It happened. She probably just talks tough, thought Nadine, though she didn't quite believe it. She's just some ugly dyke who wants to be the teacher's pet. Try it. See what happens. I don't understand how Nadine can be like, that girl is obviously bluffing, when Nadine bit a woman's arm off so that the flesh was hanging off of her arm. Clearly, there are problem children at this place. They end up in the middle of nowhere at seemingly a cabin with this thin blonde woman in the maxi dress that had been on the stage. That would be Mrs. Glover. Switch over to Felix's perspective as they are led into the house and he gets mad that they were brought here to do housework. He says, quote, "Is this a scam?" he wondered, squeezing excess water from the sponge and starting on the corner where the kitchen cabinets and the ones under the breakfast bar met. They drag us here to make us do their housework? There had to be more convenient Mexicans around. He thinks about how his dad attacked him when he destroyed the dress that he was given and cut his hair off. Quote, "Stop thinking about this shit," he told himself, tensing his stomach muscles as he drew the sponge back toward himself. A clean streak gleamed wetly on the sticky floor. "In 3 years, you'll be 18. You'll leave for college someplace cheap in case he cuts you off, and you can be a pussy once it's over." He thinks someday he might have a daughter who doesn't hate him the way that he hates his father, and he won't be ashamed of her for crying. Switch over to Nadine, who is in the living room, and she hears, quote, "Heavy footfalls for the storybook giant. Fee, fi, fo, fum, don't do drugs, have sex, or come." Pastor Eddie's reflection appears in the window over the sink, his huge frame filling the doorway. The brass rumble of his voice seemed to force all the air out of the kitchen. Nadine's put to work in the kitchen watching the roast, and she sees something out the window winding in the grass. A grinning face, something weird. It startles her. Big man Pastor Eddie asks her what's up, and she says that she was startled by the steam coming out of the roast. He just laughs at how girls are silly and sensitive, and then he walks away. Everyone goes back to their duties, including Cheryl. Quote, "Cheryl, face twisted into line rictus, crawled roach-like through the garden on all fours." The boys are then on their way back from whatever it was that they were doing, and Gabe's thinking about how the boys where he's from are probably gossiping about him and think that he's trash. And all of the boys here don't really like him either. Gabe trips and lands on a pile of nasty gunk, and the other boys catch up and make fun of him. Brady steps forward and says that that's not cow shit. Those are pellets those are the pellets that owls vomit out when they can't digest something. The boys pick on them more, and Gabe follows Brady's lead by shoving it in the other kids' faces how stupid they are and how those are owl pellets. The other boys back off because that works, and then Gabe says that he feels like he belongs. He also thinks about how there was no way that those were actually owl pellets because, no. Switch over to Felix, and he is eating, unhappy with the food, whatever it is, and wondering what Nadine saw out the window. Was it a kid getting raped? They all assume that they're going to be raped at some point in this book. And then he's thinking about missing his family, but then he pushes off that feeling to ask Gabe about falling into poop. That's all that happens in that perspective. And I was like, why are we here? It was just more angst, and it makes me feel like the author had no idea what to do with these characters, so it padded the book by just switching perspectives to repeat angst at you that would amount to nothing later in the future. Switch over to Joe and Nadine sneaking around, following Cheryl around. Nadine is chasing, Joe's following, telling her that they're going to get in trouble, they're going to get caught, so they need to go back. Cheryl crawls under the crawl space of one of the cabins and then comes out of the door a second later. Nadine and Joe are like, how did she do that? There's a trap door? What's going on? This was literally just a setup. Like, she didn't accomplish anything. She didn't need to do that because she wasn't even pretending to be in that building. This was just to show these two about the trap door so that they can use it later. But sensically, in the story, there was no reason for her to do that. Switching over to Shelby eating, they're all being told eating time is over. Start cleaning everything up and get ready for class in 10 minutes. Shelby cleans up her plate and dishes, but burns her hands along with John because everything is so hot. And then they all go to class, which looks like some kind of nonsense. Now, because it's a Bible camp, you would think that there would be some kind of Bible classes, right? Specifically, they're like, let's read Leviticus. Let's read the story of Sodom and Gomorrah so I can nail it into you what's going to happen to your gay asses if you don't fix it. But no, that's not what happens. Instead, it's psychobiology. Shelby gets yelled at for not paying attention. We get another pointless chapter and switch to POVs of Gabe after class. His brain is pudding, and everybody is gathered to be talked to by Eddie. Quote, First day's tough, said Pastor Eddie after a few moments had passed, with only the pop and crackle of the fire to break the silence. Bet your blood's pumping, though. Bet you haven't worked that hard a day in your lives, am I right? No one said anything. I was down in the mines when I was a boy, 8 years old, picking up spill, humping water 60, 70 feet underground. His small dark eyes glittered in the firelight as he looked around at them, and Gabe felt a sympathetic spasm of claustrophobia clutch his throat. I bet most of you haven't been worked yet. Not really. Rich parents, soft hands, think the world owes you something just for waking up. And why wouldn't you expect it? Pastor Eddie asked. He sounded genuine. Look where you are now, tossed to someone else by parents who don't have the guts to teach you themselves how to be in the world. The minute things got hard, they pushed you out of the nest and paid someone else to fix the problem. Throw money at it, right? You're confused right now. Your age, that's natural. What isn't is what you all have gotten yourselves into without real men to show you limits, to set boundaries. With your mothers out playing boardroom games instead of giving you a household, they're weak and they abandon you. Gabe over here is zoning out, watching John and all of the other kids cry, but especially John. Quote, a few of the kids around the fire were crying. Gabe swallowed, fighting the urge himself. A few places down the circle, the fat boy John was sniffing and wiping his nose on a sleeve of his shirt, crying like a girl. He looked like a girl, with his fat tits resting on top of the shelf of his belly and his soft round face, his double chin and the stretch marks on his big heavy thighs. He looked like a fat girl, and Gabe found himself hating him for it, contempt bubbling at the back of his throat, so hot that it almost burned to keep it inside. If your parents are weak, what are you? If our parents are weak, what are we? He wrenched his gaze from John and stared at Pastor Eddie, at the huge, long slab of a face with its thick mustache and little glasses. We're supposed to, what, thank you? Love you? He thought of Francis straddling his hips and at that lean, muscular ass rubbing against his hard cock, pressing it against his belly until he could hardly breathe, until he wanted to scream. I'm not fucking confused, thought Gabe. Just say it. Just call us faggots. Stop fucking lying and say it. And then he thinks about what Miss Armitage said about the evolution being a braid is BS. Quote, that was bullshit. Fake science. Evolution was a road continually diverging, an unimaginable vast tree stretching back to a single squirming cell. Each generation, a billion coin tosses fed through a meat grinder of eat or be eaten. How the fuck would it be a braid? Snakes didn't turn back into lizards. Birds didn't grow fangs and swell to huge and terrible sizes. Dinosaurs reborn out of chicken coops and pet shops. Was this supposed to be some sort of reference to the psychobiology class that they were in? Because if so, it doesn't really feel accurate. Then Gabe thinks that he sees something out in the wilderness eyes, though he's not sure what they belong to. Then it's lights out. At this point, I was like, this book doesn't even know how to do creepy. Like, was that supposed to be creepy? Was that supposed to be atmospheric? Because it's not. We get a new character perspective named Malcolm, and it opens with exposition dumping where Malcolm's brother Ian killed himself at 16. He talks about how his dad was charming and tried to put a smile on people's faces, and he does the same. And he's sure that's why Betty and her gang were beating on him just now. Apparently, he was outside the girls' cabins, and now he's just getting beat up by them on the ground. It sounds a bit counterintuitive to them trying to convert these kids to being straight. If this was supposed to be a Pray the Gay Away camp, they might be like, great job, buddy. You want a pair of panties with your visit? You know, something. An old man named Garth shows up and tells the girls to get off Malcolm. He helps Malcolm up and then shoves him against the cabin wall and grabs his crotch. Again, seems counterintuitive to the whole Pray the Gay Away thing, but who am I to judge your curriculum? The girls are just standing there watching. Betty is getting freaking juiced and frothing. The air, basically, Utah becomes a swamp with how frothy this woman gets by watching this exchange. He releases the kid, telling him to go shower. Betty says a bad word at him, and then they run off. Oh, look, his mom was the problem that his dad was coping with, because it's like always the women that are the problem in this book. And then Malcolm falls to the ground sad, realizing that smiling is for you, to tell other people who hurt you that you're fine so that they can walk away feeling good about themselves. Now we're in Joe's POV and we skip through perception class. Prayer is mentioned, calisthenics and midnight hikes are brought up. She lays in bed, masturbates the pain away, and then she just does chores, gets blisters. No one gives her gauze for her wounds, and so she uses her shirt. Joe is noticing that Candace is looking thin, and that thin reminds her of an animal about to die. She asks if Candace is okay and notices that Candace is getting all the worst jobs on the campsite. Candace says that she's tired, has a headache, and can't sleep. Cheryl grabs Candace to go inside, and there's a lot of focus on grub in this moment. Switch over to Shelby's perspective. Quote, Shelby had always sat to pee. When she was younger, Ruth had liked this, had considered it the first sign of budding homosexuality, and encouraged it the same way that she encouraged Shelby's love for Sailor Moon and baking and dancing to ABBA. She wanted the kind of polite and waifish gay boy her friends sometimes produced, something witty and dry and tastefully aristocratic to go with that little cream-colored Dwar clutch that she carried at openings. Peeing while sitting down, though, had proved to lead to an entirely different set of qualities. Stealing Ruth's pantyhose, trying on her lipstick applied in messy smears and painstakingly shaped with a wetted cotton pad, it led to slumped shoulders and long hair. She missed her hair so badly then. Sitting in the graffitied stall attached to the camp's mess that she began to cry a little, and to the falsies lifted from Pussycats, the sex shop over on 4th that she'd slipped into one day after school when she'd seen two girls kissing in a back room, one sliding her finger past the waistband of the other's skirt to stroke the clear arch of a cock. How did she get into this place? Look, if she was allowed to stay in a sex shop, then I would assume that illicit activities with children are happening there. Because usually, as far as I'm aware, legitimate sex shop owners don't want kids in there because it's a crime. So if you got it, and they watch the door to make sure that you are of age. People can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure you actually have to try to be a child to sneak into. Does this just not sit right with anybody else? Or again, it's bad adults. Also, let me get this straight. Ruth was super excited to encourage budding homosexuality and effeminate behavior in her child, but when Shelby went trans instead of being gay, that's the go-to conversion camp territory. Now, that also seems counterintuitive to Ruth because Ruth wants a gay, but a conversion camp would theoretically also remove the gays. She wouldn't have the effeminate designer gay kid that she wants anyway. She would have a straight kid. So, like, maybe sending Shelby to a camp specifically for trans people would have been better to not end up curing her designer Gaby. Nadine comes in looking for something hidden by one of the counselors. How or why she knows it's in the bathroom, I don't know. Stuff just randomly happens to be knowledgeified in here. She asks Shelby for help looking for it. Shelby cooperates, but mostly stands around as Nadine does the work. When someone comes in, it's Corey, a camp counselor, who is looking for Shelby. Nadine pushes them both into the stall together and then climbs onto the toilet to start peeing. Nadine then tells Shelby to say something as Shelby is there watching Nadine's vulva and the description of piss falling on everything. After Corey leaves without even collecting Shelby, Nadine, you would think if he comes in looking for Shelby and Shelby is hanging out in the stalls, he'd be like, okay, finish your business. I'm standing right here waiting for you because I'm sussy of you, kid. After Corey leaves without collecting Shelby, Nadine says her name and then kisses Shelby. Quote, the other girl smiled. Her lips parted as she leaned in. Their mouths came together and she tasted like morning breath and cinnamon, like sweat and orange juice and pussy, gross and hot and perfect, sucking and nipping, spit between them when they parted to breathe, too much tongues, teeth scraping Shelby's chin, hungry, perfect, perfect, perfect. Switch over to Malcolm, and he's sleeping. He hears something, gets up to investigate. Quote, something was scratching at the cabin door, and Malcolm rose up slowly onto one elbow, fumbling for his glasses in the dark. Every inch of his body hurt like hell, and the bruises where Betty had kicked him are throbbing in sync. There was something moving in the slit of moonlight coming in under the door. Had his fingers found plastic, and he slid the lenses on his nose. Squinting as the gloom came into focus, a wash of grays, browns, and blacks, and beneath the door a wiggling shape. Fingers? His heart was pounding in his ears. Vic's muttering grew louder. Malcolm listened for a moment as the other boy hissed, "Mommy, Mommy!" in a flat, cold voice. He slipped out of his bunk, the floorboards rough and cool under his feet, and took a step toward the door. "You're having a nightmare," he thought calmly as he lowered himself to the floor. "This isn't real. You're home in Riverside in your bed, and Mom is crying in the next room over, crying and crying like she always is, but never any tears." The things, fingers, under the doors withdrew without a sound. Malcolm knelt, holding still, and pressed his bruised cheek to the floorboard. He could see the scratches where whatever it was had dug into the door's soft and graying pine. Nothing else remained. I don't know how this person is celebrated in horror. There isn't even a little bit of tension in this scene for me. It just felt like nothing. Switch over to Shelby's POV, and she is sleeping, but a thump wakes her up. Then the other boys also wake up. Randomly, there's a "Here's Johnny" reference suddenly before it goes into Shelby wondering if Nadine will acknowledge what happened with them in the bathroom. Because apparently the "Here's Johnny" thing was Joe, Nadine, and Felix sneaking into the cabin without a problem. Like, there are no camp counselors anywhere. There's nobody guarding anything. There's no camp counselors in the rooms with the kids to make sure that they stay in bed, to make sure they perform lights out. And there is no, there's nobody walking around the area to make sure that kids are doing what they need to do and not sneaking around. They talk about the weird dogs that Malcolm mentioned on night one, and then the weird classes about plants in the garden and having nightmares. For me, listening to these kids go back and forth on this, none of these things really seem wild beyond we don't actually get to see any of this stuff. Like, if we're looking at the current situation, which they're all stressed, they're all overworked, they're all underfed. And so all of these seem like stress-related items that they could all be suffering from, as opposed to something that is so outlandish that you would be like, yeah, something is weird about all of this. The book's been too focused with hurting the kids in different perspectives, as opposed to showing the eerie things about this place and building question as to what is going on. They say that it's not just a Mormon thing that's throwing everything off. It's something else. And they know that the headaches are also related to this, not just stress and heat strokes. Out of nowhere, everyone is suddenly friendly, acting like they've always been friends, and we've barely seen any of them really interact. They're like, "This place is so fucked. Let's try not to get brainwashed, okay? Can we just have a good time before tomorrow gets here?" And then Shelby is thinking about these people and how they're now her friends. When did this happen? Move over to Malcolm's perspective while he's digging a hole and thinking about hearing people come over and talking about their jobs and how his mom would watch everything, building lists of things to complain about. And this turns into a dream of an old white woman forcing a kiss on him. He calls her soft and precise and respectably white. Then this turns into a monster devouring him, and he wakes up and his pants are soiled with cum. And then he sinks back into a hole that, quote, "a womb in the earth that fit him like a second skin down to the last pube." "Wait," he tried to say, but only a strained breath escaped his lungs, and the mud rained down on him, hard enough to bruise and stun, and did not stop until the world was black and cold and silent. Switch over to Nadine, and the girls are going through a trapdoor to get back into their room. I have no semblance of what time it is for any of this. How much time has passed, or what any of this actually does for these characters. Quote, "Nadine pulled herself through the trapdoor in the floor of cabin 2 and knelt to help Joe and Felix up after her. Her head was swimming pleasantly as they restacked the linen. She felt warm. Her stomach fluttered with the memory of her kiss goodbye. She'd never really thought about being with a transvestite, but Shelby felt like a girl in her arms, soft and shy and so achingly sweet. She found herself grinning as she shut the door, though in the pit of her stomach a little worm of guilt squirmed relentlessly at the thought of Tess's dimpled smile. Turns out that roommate Smith didn't come with them when they snuck out, didn't report them, which, considering she's been captured by the brain thing basically, or is being poisoned by the brain thing, you'd think that she would have alerted somebody But that would require consequences, which would break up the story that this author is obviously possibly trying to tell, or the plans and where this author is trying to go, and would actually make them think. And I found that a lot of authors don't like changing their plan. So they just say, screw the natural consequences of actions. Anyway, Smith didn't come, and in the morning, she's already gone out of her bed. Also pretty amazing that despite Cheryl kind of worming around all the time during the day, even when the kids are active, there was nobody worming around outside while the kids were supposed to be in bed. Switch over to Gabe's POV now, and they're out digging holes again, and he's thinking of all of the boys having similar dreams, and it's a bit of mass hysteria. Just that. And some of the boys in the cabin were missing that morning, said that they would have gone somewhere with Pastor Eddie. And then he's having a flashback to childhood where it sounds like he was sexually abused by his mother. Quote, the smell of her perfume came without warning to the forefront of his memory, a thin and clinging cloud of citrus over the buttery scent of vanilla. He nearly retched. He could smell her sour sweat beneath it and a musty stink of the lake house his grandparents had left her. They'd been alone. His dad and his little sister, Mackenzie, had gone out for ice cream. Gabe hadn't wanted any. Already at 8 years of age, he had begun to feel the outspoken virtue of starvation, the sickly shadowed pleasure of denying himself something in which others would indulge. I'm going to give you an examination, and it's best that we keep it between just the two of us. Let's call it doctor-patient confidentiality. Do you understand, honey? She'd never called him honey before, and although he knew something was wrong, although his skin prickled with goosebumps and his thoughts began to stretch into a single timeless disembodied smear as she bent in front of him where he sat at the kitchen table, he wanted to say it again. He wanted her to love him, to act the way that other moms at Hebrew school acted when they came to pick their kids up. Hugs, ruffled hair. He could feel the wrongness sweeping through the camp. He could feel the lake reaching for him out of the past, a wave driving other kids before it, sweeping them all towards something at the edge of understanding. And then he's like, we need to get out of here before it's too late. Again, bizarre pacing. Again, so people, especially bad writers, like to lean on forcing trauma on their characters as if making the reader read trauma is, 1, going to deepen your characters, 2, make me care about your characters, and 3, have any meaning. There's no meaning in this if you don't explore the outcome, the consequences, and the outcome or consequences of trauma, and or how they deal with that trauma, how they cope with that trauma, how they either grow or fail to conquer the trauma. So then when you just throw this stuff in there and it's a throwaway to say, hey, look, this kid was abused like all the other 60 million in this book, I don't freaking care. There is no purpose to it. It's just basic garbage, non-character development where you think that it's a cheat code to say, hey, molestering happened. Feel bad yet? No, tell me why. And if you're not going to tell me why it happened, then at least show me how it affected this kid and how it affected this kid's family and what the rest of this kid's family thinks. Because there's no purpose to doing this if we don't see the consequences. But in these kinds of crappy writer books, they never go into that because they just like to throw trauma at you for shock factor, which is often why they lean into rape and molestation through incest constantly. And I can't help but notice, again, it is the mother because Gretchen Felker-Martin has got a lot of what feels like woman hate in their books. Switch over to Nadine's perspective with an immediate description of her getting her period, even though it's not plot relevant at all, and she's actually just asking the camp counselor where Smith is. The thing literally starts with that description. No one will tell her where Smith is, and then they have to go to work, and Nadine wants to kill Betty and her clique. Switch to Felix, and they're being forced to run around carrying tires, and a fight breaks out with one of the counselors. Nadine gets kicked between the legs and starts to bleed, and Felix stands up for her to try and stop the counselor from beating Nadine in. Cheryl says that they're trying to help her, and Joe is crying and held back. Betty whispers to Felix, "You're next, faggot." And again, I think that we've gotten away from why these kids are even here, because wouldn't Betty have calling Felix a girl name, her actual birth name or her dead name if she wanted to get to Felix? Because Felix is a female to male transsexual or transvestite. And so if you acknowledge that you see Felix as a male by calling him faggot, then you are confirming his gender identity. Whereas if you call him Missy, if you call him by his birth name, if you call him anything that would actually affect that you are not showing me what you think you're showing me, or I don't acknowledge your appearance, then that would do more damage. But it says it's a conversion therapy camp, and there is nothing about this that's conversion therapy. It's just gender conforming the entire time, which partially speaks to me to this idea that this author may not actually be able to write things that they are either against or their unwillingness to explore or do things that are wrong. Because I remember, or what they consider wrong, because I remember in Manhunt, even the TERFs would still correctly gender the trans people, even though clearly the TERFs probably would not. But it's like they can't violate their own beliefs. Switch over to Nadine's perspective. Suddenly Nadine is in a house with Mrs. Glover while she is having sex with Pastor Eddie. How that happened, I don't know. How she got there, I don't know. A lot of these authors also that are trad-pubbed, because this book is trad-pubbed, also have no idea how to do scene transitions, how to set the scene, how to explain how we get somewhere when there's a time skip. They just kind of throw you in there and assume that you're going to get it. And why are we specifically there when the two old people are having sex? It's partially, it just feels like the author thinks horror is listening to old people have sex. And so the author is like, You spooked yet? You spooked? It's spooky, right? Old people? Gretchen also continues to let you know that they always had it out for this woman, since every perspective thinks sharply and has since moment one. Quote, it was so faked, so staged. The breathy, girlish exclamations of, "Oh, Eddie," like he was taking her on a magic carpet ride beneath the sea of stars instead of ramming his dick up into her mildewy box. So she's sneaking around the house somehow, again, without counselors watching, because she could, break stuff, use the phone, steal stuff. There's nobody overseeing these troublesome kids that are here because they're not great people, who are here because their parents got rid of them for this, because, Nadine was biting people's arms off. She was basically going bath salt zombie person to not get there, but nobody is watching her. I don't know how we got here or why she is just running circles in the yard. What is pacing of this book? She hears them answer a phone somewhere and she's like, "Oh, we can use that to call for help out of here." Then she is grabbed and punched and taken outside and left to shovel the horse poop and clean up the barn that she is happy to do because she likes the smell of shit, and this is better than doing dishes. So we're not doing woman's work anymore either. Conversion therapy is completely, the idea of whatever they think conversion therapy is has completely been lost on this. And we are just now kind of getting the idea that the thing is a full farm, because there are also cows, apparently. She's thinking about how she likes being sweaty, and then when her girlfriend called her Nate. And the author continues to think that they're being edgy with random stuff like, quote, "They put little bits of shit in weasel oil and rotting things in perfume," she remembered, "to make it smell like sex and like death. There was a sweetness to it, though, a sticky, syrupy scent." This isn't horror. This is an author being a tryhard. As if to try and prove that, Nadine finds a random dead cow in there that somehow she didn't smell a while ago when she entered the place, because you would be smelling a rotting cow the moment you get anywhere near the freaking barn. It's covered in maggots and it's being eaten out, and she didn't smell the rot before. She then hallucinates a monstrous version of her dentist calling to her, crawling to her, a feeling of a hand inside of her stomach, and she falls and vomits, and then it's gone. She then notices how the cow that's there has a bite taken out of it that's as big as a human mouth, too big to be anything other than a human mouth bite. And then we switch to a lot of kids being in a group together. Gabe is freaking out about something being inside of him and vomiting, and then saying that it got out of him until he calms down. No one knows what's going on, and they're all out there digging holes. It's amazing how they're all together, and also like some switch went off in the plot saying that we needed to get something done. Oh, and Gabe now says it's kissing Nadine right now, probably meaning the thing in the barn. Whatever that, though, we never get any confirmation. We never get to visit that again or what that means, and it never happens again. The perspective of Joe turns into Nadine. At lunch, they're thinking about Smith's empty bed, which is still empty, and then immediately a couple of sentences about food and randomly her aunt dying of cancer, and then they're determining they're going to escape soon. Nadine shows up and looks a mess, and Nadine says that something is wrong and it's happening around here and they need to get the frick out. Switch over to Felix's perspective and this thing that's called the graduation. The girls sneak into the boys' cabin again with ease. They talk about how they're going to be getting out of this place. They're talking about how they can do a phone call from the farmhouse to Joe's grandpa, who's at a retirement home, and he can drive a car to come pick them up, and then they can zoom out of here. He is only in New Jersey, which is pretty far from Utah, but whatever. And they're not going to tell any other kids because they don't know who they can trust, and they need to get out as soon as possible. We get this beautiful contender for why would you even bother saying it. Quote, one by one, the others mutter in their agreement. It didn't feel much like the Three Musketeers crossing their swords, but Felix knew that it was a little kid's way of looking at it anyway. The book mentions hating adults for getting away with things, but it really just sounds like the narrative hating adults for stopping creeps from being perverts, and they make their plans to escape and say, quote, they had to. For the first time in his life, he had friends, real friends. He wasn't going to let them get murdered by Jesus freaks or die of dehydration. There's been no Jesus in this camp, if you haven't noticed. They've been beaten more than they've read the Bible or talked about Christ, because that would have required some sort of research to actually put Bible verses in here. At this point, I checked. The book used the name of Jesus 12 times throughout the entire thing, and one of them was the pastor at the funeral in the very beginning. All of the others were exclamations of surprise by the kids. None of them are uttered while the kids are at the camp, and technically, the gay kids call Jesus' name more than any of these supposed Jesus freaks. As you can see, I got very upset. I got very frustrated at this book at this point because the author couldn't be bothered to research the setting of their own book that they chose and marketed it as this. I don't give a frick if you have a hate boner for Christians. Tell me a story that you've promised in your publication and got a star rating for, where other companies, where book publishers, where book reviewers are carrying your dirty, stinky bag, because I know how much you like the stink. Because all I see right now are people sucking toes, and I don't know why. It is such the amount of praise and reference to this because it says it's a conversion camp, but nobody bothered to actually insert anything in here to make that setting, and it's received awards and accolades from traditional magazines. And it makes me go, makes you think. Makes you wonder. The kids argue about what they're going to do even if they escape. How could they survive on their own since they're all a bunch of kids? And also, like, how would you even get out of here? Where is the newest town? Joe brings the boiling of the room down, and Felix admires her for it, while also choosing the opportunity to be jealous that the other kids know how to hook up and he doesn't. Quote, Felix stared at her, wondering what it was like to be able to unpick a situation like that, to know what to say to calm everyone down and to show them a new way forward. He didn't have it. He felt the lack of it all of his life, the same way that he'd so often felt others pairing off by means of some hidden language, disappearing into private worlds that he wouldn't see or hear or touch. He watched it happen between Nadine and Shelby with a dull ache of envy in the pit of his stomach. A certainty that no one would ever show him the way of that beautiful place of being wanted or of wanting. Felix is prepping for incel territory, and in case you are wondering, Felix is alone in the end. He is the only one who is alone in the end. He will also spend the next 16 years alone as well. Somebody interpret that for me. Going over to Gabe, he's nervous doing the prep work and going to science class, which again, you want to go off on this place being full of Jesus freaks when we've spent more time going over stuff like this than the Bible. Quote, the arm is made up of 4 independent muscle groups, Armitage continued, jabbing the point of her dry erase marker at the diagram she'd drawn on the whiteboard. Gabe blinked, trying to bring his notebook into focus. His head was swimming, his stomach sour with anxiety, and he could hardly read his own handwriting. Something from yesterday's lesson on metempsychic transmission, the movement of thoughts as discrete chemical entities through physical matters. Each subgroup receives impulses from the cogitaire carnis, which roughly translate means gray matter, which in turn passes through the avicti carni, or ganglion cluster, secondary processing centers for the commands our brains send to our limbs. The end result is that of hundreds of different muscular structures in our bodies act as a unified whole, even though the human animal is in fact a colony of independent organisms. Now, can anyone tell me what keeps our muscles functioning in unity? It's this section that also brought me to check the book for how many times Bible was mentioned, which is 4. 3 of them are insults, and 1 of them was at a church service for the beginning, where the chick was saying in the Bible it says that women must submit to their husbands. That's it. That's all. Nobody on this campground actually has a Bible. They get together for a graduation dinner / campfire, bonfire, where they're just being told who is doing better than others. Then there's, I guess, some people coming in looking like models. That's how they're described, talking about how they've been helped by this camp. And one kid said that he was with an older man telling him what he wanted to hear, but he was being taken advantage of. And Joe's thinking about having heard Eddie and the old lady having sex the other day. And another one at the campfire just mentions having his butt stretched by some college freshman. And Joe keeps thinking about the pastor having sex with the wife and how she walked in on her parents, and she hyper visualizes every detail of the silver slime because this is what the author apparently thinks horror is. Joe calls her parents Nazis and wishes that she wasn't here. That is the only reference to Nazis in this book. So we got Nazis and we got Turner Diaries. Nadine appears with some of the other kids, bent over a seat, pants down, and is spanked by Eddie's belt hand. She is then taken away. It turns out that Candace has also been someone who had helped hold Nadine down as she got whacked, and she's covered in welts all over her skin as well. Pastor Eddie threatens them all that they'll go to jail if they don't follow the rules. He's doing them a favor to stop the gay from going to jail. Gabe's POV, he's brushing his teeth as he catches up with Candace, and he thinks that she looks weird, but he can't talk to her. Candace says that she's going home tomorrow. He asks her if they can exchange addresses so that he can send her letters, and she's like, yeah, sure, of course. Then Gabe hears some mental stuff that's not his. It looks like it's probably Felix's or Nadine's or something. And they're getting mind melded because the creature feature in this is telepathic and hive-minded, and they're getting pulled in. The boys then get together to talk about how Candace must have been replaced like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And then Shelby thinks about Nadine's beautiful face being beaten up and falls asleep. Shelby then dreams about when Mom Stell left, and Shelby was left with Ruth, who randomly decides to talk about menstruation at Shelby and be like, you want to know what you're trying to take from us, as she picks up an iron and threatens Shelby with it. Somehow, despite Nadine just getting thwapped for sneaking around, because they were also like, you see this? We're going to spank her with the belt because she was trying to steal food from the camp. So despite her getting caught for sneaking around, nobody is guarding her cabin. So Shelby can actually sneak into Nadine's bed, and you get, quote, her heart thrummed in her chest. She wet her lips, painfully conscious of her belly spilling over the waistband of her underwear, and her little nipples, hard like little pink rosebuds, and the sparse, itchy stubble on her throat and jaw. Shelby climbs into the bed and kisses Nadine, and there's no way that this isn't a fetish and possible personal validation. Quote, the taller girl lay back, wincing as she wriggled into position, and Shelby smelled the deep, dark heat of her period in the moment before her lips met Nadine's bruised and swollen pussy. She could hardly think. In her fantasies of slipping into Nadine's bed, she'd pictured stroking the other girl's hair, cradling her as she wept, things that you'd see on the cover of one of Stell's weepy lesbian romance novels. She licked the soft, wet flesh in front of her, trying not to hyperventilate. What if I eat pussy like a man? Should be noted, Nadine is also mentioned as having a larger clitoris at this point. So it feels like the author is treating a clitoris like a penis. In a couple of places. The teenagers have sex, and Shelby is obsessed with the bleeding. Switch over to Smith's POV, and she wakes up to the smell of death and thinks about how her dad had to call someone to break the walls open to get the guinea pig corpse out of her house. And then when she went outside, she saw her dad macking on the guy that he called over to get the thing out. And seeing this happen made her feel like she was on her period. That's not a joke. Quote, even the memory made her feel hot and sick and flustered, distant from herself, like she was on her period. I'm starting to wonder if that's the only thing that this author thinks women feel or are defined by. Let me know what your thoughts are on that in the comments below. She recognizes that she's in some kind of cave and there are a bunch of glowworms, and she thinks about someone that she used to know. Quote, gradually, Smith realizes that it wasn't quite dark anymore. She was in a cave, and on the cavern ceiling, pinpricks of bluish light were kindling slowly from the gloom, some still, others moving in slow waves, and she thought that they must be glowworms or some kind of fireflies. Alan loved watching nature documentaries. Smith thought that they were boring, could find nothing moving about footage of howler monkeys scratching themselves or eating fruit, but it meant a chance to press her leg against Alan's and to see the blush rise in his face, to hold his sweaty hand in hers. Everyone else called him Tabitha and sometimes Tabby, but they were speaking to a ghost. Only Smith and a few friends at school knew the truth, had been entrusted to hold it between them. She missed him so badly, and she wished that they could have seen each other in the one last time before the family moved. But after her mother found them together, it had been non-stop hellfire. Her new church was scary. Smith had heard other women tell her mother that she'd been raped her whole marriage, that a faggot had profaned the sacrament to humiliate her. Then she's got her voice in her head taunting her and telling her that her dad fucks little boys, and asks her if she was hot and bothered watching her dad get it on with some man in the yard. It tells her not to worry, that it'll all be over soon. The most stereotypical shallow BS in existence, to be shocking, but it's just boring. In case you need to know how edgy this author is, quote, never alone, touch you, feel you mine, wear your skin, stretch out your little holes, baby worm before me, bow, crawl in the dark, the blind fetus, little clot. It's the telepathy of the creature. Then some creature eats her, and it's a different sort of creature than described by Casey at the beginning of this book. Going over to Malcolm, the boys are taken out somewhere to dig ditches. They all get into fights with one another while they're talking nonstop about period blood being caught in the ditches, because apparently that's a fixation that we're into right now. Malcolm gets into a fight with Vic over this, and they separate. Vic goes off that way. A dog that Malcolm saw before comes up and then leads Malcolm away, and he just trusts it and just walks into the desert. Switch over to Nadine's POV, where nothing is happening. She's just cutting peppers, saying the word pussy over and over and over again in her head, reading someone's thoughts without realizing it, thinking in detail about what Eddie's doing upstairs, banging his wife, because I guess the author is also fixated on that right now. Then she's thinking about how she wants to suck Shelby's dick, even though dicks make her feel gross. And then Cheryl snaps at her for daydreaming. Nadine notices something weird under Cheryl's skin and wonders what the frick she is, because she is clearly not human. And that's the end of that scene. Malcolm finds an abandoned bunker in the middle of nowhere where there are MREs. Everything looks like it hasn't been touched in a while. There's a dead skeleton guy rotting away in the bathroom shower. And then he finds a safe that is fortunately hanging open and full of dynamite. Sounds like somebody is being exceptionally lazy in storytelling. Get back to everybody sitting together, and they're talking about how, because there are all those MREs and they don't have to steal food anymore, because at least they can eat those MREs, and it's actually going to happen that they're going to get away. They also talk about how the food tastes funny. Why the food tastes funny, we never actually get to. Switch over to Joe's perspective, and she's thinking about how she wants Felix inside of her, and gets up, and then she feels like she's high. Quote, she closed her eyes, swaying where she stood, and the thought that she was probably high on something flitted through her mind. She smoked weed a few times with Carly Prince, who she'd known since kindergarten, and whose breasts she regularly imagined burying her face in when she masturbated. But this didn't feel like that. It felt like falling into itself, like missing the last step on the set of stairs and then hanging forever in what moment your senses all blown out of your body as you tried to recalibrate, to summon some response to the collision between certainty and chaos. She sneaks out of bed, and it seems like she is high, and there are orgies happening everywhere, and they are also high, and everything is rainbows, and keep going forward outside, and she wishes that she'd been punished more, because she has a bit of a martyr complex, as we're going to find. Quote, the ghost of the fire still danced in the air, sparks and cylinders drifting on the cold night wind. When she'd seen Nadine and Felix beaten, part of her had wished that it was her, not them, on display like that, her ass clenching in anticipation of each crack of the belt, her snot and tears mingling and dripping from her chin as she squirmed and wailed. For a moment, she was in the locker room of the Concord YMCA, a travel meet 3 years before, and dozens of girls were pinching and groping shouting or hissing "Dyke, Dyke, Dyke," and calling her Jap and Gook. And her friend Helen Strand was staring at her through the press of bodies, eyes wide, not going for help, not moving, not trying to stop it. I want to be nailed to a cross and burned, and I want everyone to think how beautiful I look and how sorry they are. Then she runs into Brady, who helps her get to Pastor Eddie's house to call her grandpa. There are no adults anywhere. There are no obstacles. They just get there. Switch over to Malcolm, and he's just hanging out with John, asking John what he thinks Pretty Boy is doing. Pretty Boy refers to Gabe. John says, well, I think you're prettier than Pretty Boy, and so then they kiss. John says that he'll show him how to kiss better because he's not that good. They're all drugged. They must be, and nothing is happening. Switch over to Nadine's perspective, just so Shelby and Nadine can have sex. Switch over to Gabe's perspective, and he's thinking about how Malcolm and John are together and how he wants to put somebody's breasts in his mouth and how he has breasts and how it's not fair that John has breasts and it's disgusting or it's beautiful and he can't decide which it is. He's probably tripping out too right now. Let's be real. He closes his eyes in his cabin and he is thinking about when he was 9. Quote, when he was 9, his aunt and uncle, his mother's sister Lorraine, and her husband Glenn, with his pink polos and moussed blonde hair, had taken him to the Massachusetts Museum of Fine Arts to see the birth of Venus. There had been a fight afterward, his mother and his sister cutting at each other with the cold politeness that was the family's favorite knife. Exchanging words like concerned about the impact of pornography on his development and things are changing. It's not like it was in the 70s, but Gabe hadn't cared about it. All he had been able to think about was Venus in that shell, the sweet candy curves and the folds of her, the faraway look in her eyes, and the wind pulling her pale golden hair as she stepped out into the world. He had looked at himself in the mirror that night and had then spent an hour dragging safety pins along his inner arm until this huge and awful feeling in his stomach went away. He hadn't seen his aunt since, except at Christmas and Thanksgiving up at Nana's house in Madbury. I want to come out of the sea, he thought, and all of the desperation climbed up out of him as though he were throwing up a snake, a centipede, as long as he was tall. He was on his knees, coughing, and bile was clinging to his lips, and where it puddled in the dirt, he saw those foaming breakers smashing themselves on the sand, and the clear wash as they kissed the earth and drew back the sea, and her pale feet, fat and soft like little dinner rolls, sinking into the silt, crabs no bigger than fingernails, scuttling over her toes, and he felt her hand on the back of his neck and the salty kiss of her wet lip and the weight of her soaking mane of hair like the one the unknown man had cut away from him the day that he got to camp, and Gabe now declares that he is a girl. Joe is then sneaking around the ranch hands that are guarding a crater that is being mentioned for the very first time. And there are a bunch of birds over here that look like hummingbirds, but they aren't, and they're sucking blood out of a body. Joe's kind of jealous at how pretty they are, calls it a cuckoo, though she's with Brady, I don't think Brady actually sees it, and then they just continue on to the pastor's house. Back to Gabe, he's thinking that he needs to apologize to Shelby because he knows the feeling now of how she feels, and he feels like he judged her too hard for being trans, and he didn't understand it before. While traveling around the campgrounds, again, apparently unsupervised, he sees a mangled dog on the ground, just laying there in the middle of the area, right outside of the crawling path in front of a cabin. And one of the camp counselors, Corey, comes out from the crawl space under the cabin just to grab the dog and pull it back in. And it also starts kissing him with tongue and probably tentacles because it says that something sickly sweet shows up. End scene. Joe and Brady then find the phone and phone her grandpa. She tells him where the camp is, or that they know that it's Utah and that it's probably called Camp Resolution. Just as Enoch and the others come into the room, Brady attacks Enoch with a table and the two of them flee the scene as the dude bleeds out on the floor. It should also be noted as they looked around this room, they found receipts for ketamine and meth, which don't turn into anything. Like, they're obviously drugged, but this just feels like a pantser throwing stuff in there that never becomes relevant later because it doesn't connect to anything, and ketamine kills the monster. And it says, like, we're gonna get there, but they have, like, they take blood from the kids, and the kids determined the blood was taken from them to make sure they weren't on party drugs, because the party drugs would hurt the cuckoo if it ingested the kids while they were high on drugs. But then they're also currently high on drugs that are being fed to them by these adults. Like, it doesn't make any sense, which just makes me feel like the author didn't know what they were doing. So Brady and Joe are running out of this place, and she's flooded with other people's memories. Describing a dog decomposing is not horror, BT dubs. If any of you think that you're going to scare anybody with a cheap shot of decomposing or dog deaths, try again. And it looks like, as they go, it looks like they're being chased by the cuckoo, because it keeps saying cuckoo as it haunts her. I don't know. It was so dumb. It's not scary. Like, you tell me how you feel about this. And for the record, satire or comedy or dark comedy is not listed on any of the tags for this. So I don't know what it's trying to do. Quote, "Cuckoo," shrieked the voice in her head. "Cuckoo, cuckoo, do you hear it, Joanna? You're not going home. Someone else got your seat on the bus, and she's just so excited to meet your parents, to meet that feeble old man rotting away where he's no good to anybody, and wring a little something useful out of him. You wouldn't believe what you can do with that one tired old man, Joanna, with the skin and his fat and the soggy, failing neurons in his demented old head. You wouldn't recognize him when I'm done with him, but he'll recognize you. He sure will. Cuckoo, cuckoo." Gabe POV. He is brought back to the farmhouse, and Eddie's wife has Corey put Gabe in the basement. He thinks about the time watching a bovine birth that traumatized him when he was 12, because the birth prolapsed the cow, and that's pretty much what the fleshy poops looked like in the forest. I'm thinking of some unresolved author trauma here. Possibly. We're just looking for interpretations here. Over with Joe, she's still running with Brady. He gets caught. She realizes that she's not brave enough because she doesn't want to go back for him. Most horror of this chapter the biggest horror of this chapter is the slur that's used. Gabe is then, continue with Gabe in the basement. There's a birthing sack of whatever the cuckoo is. Long description that is nonsense. More vomiting ensues as the creature then feeds on its vomit. Joe is confused about what's happening, though she's pretty sure that these things are going to take over their lives. Shelby and Nadine were intruded on by Corey and Marianne, and by Corey and Marianne, and grabbed from their cabin and then carried off. All of the kids are now in a pickup truck, and they're freaking out, obviously. Malcolm is like, how did I forget that Nadine is just a kid? You know, we were all ready to just run out of here and to solve this, but we're all just kids. She's a kid, no matter what she looks like, no matter how cool I thought she was. Blood is being collected from all of the camp counselors using a syringe. Eddie's wife lights a cigarette and then exposits about how she had a daughter with leukemia. And then just exposits on her captives, because they ask her about herself, and she's like, well, you want to know why I'm doing this, sweet cheeks? It's because I had a daughter, right? I had a daughter who had leukemia. And so I was doing everything within my power to deal with the leukemia until one day my daughter died. And before that, I found out that my husband, he was doing the shmoo with some kind of kid, some kind of 16, 17-year-old boy. Like, what the hell, man? You marry me and you're going to go off with a 16, 17-year-old boy, but we stick together. I don't want to start anything at church. I don't want to be dishonored. So we stick together until my daughter dies. We didn't want to make her memories of her parents shitty. Then once she died, I just, I sort of gave up. I didn't want to return to church where everybody knew that Dave was banging the newsboy. So instead, I just looked out into the desert and I just walked and I walked and I walked. And I thought that I would die and it would be God's graces that took me away, let's be honest. But instead of killing me, he gave me this bird that told me straight into my brain that it could fix my husband for me. So what did I do? You betcha. I brought that bird back to my house and it sucked up into my husband's head and made him into the perfect husband who no longer had sex with the gays. No longer did he PP betray me, but he became the man that I needed him to be. And then it said that it would fix other people too. And so we made this together. And this is why the book feels more like Stepford Wives than anything that Stephen King is known for, specifically It. Hearing this story, the kids think, quote, and then he thought about what Gabe had said about Candace, about how she had been replaced, which led him to the memory of Pastor Eddie's parting kiss just minutes before. What kissed her? The thought chased itself around in his mind like he had never thought about anything else. What put its mouth to her mouth? What did Joe hear having sex with her? What touches her at night? What, does she want it? To let it touch her? You're insane, said Felix. And then she says something about growing her daughter again with the Cuckoo, where it happened, some years ago. And this thing is like spitting out mirror faces to go and live other people's lives. So I think the Cuckoo is kind of lying to her a little bit. Otherwise, she would already have her daughter. And I don't know why she is so dumb. And I don't know why she is so dumb that she cannot tell that she is being used, apparently. But I guess she's in Delulu land. Because she's doing all this just to get a copy of her child back through the facets of the kook. And for the remainder of this, I may just call it the cuck. The kids get taken to the basement where Gabe is with the monster, and it spits out a carbon copy of one of them. And Nadine is thinking about how this thing is going to make a copy of her to go back and take her life in her place, which is also like, why wouldn't you let it? Because you already hate your parents. You think that they hate you. And so if you just let this thing spit out a baby to go live your life for you, so you can go and live your life how you want without being bothered, it's a win-win situation. And then that would have actually created a monster that was allowed to happen because they wanted to live their lives without having to deal with the rest of the consequences of actually telling their parents goodbye. But no, we don't get that. The kook sits there telling Nadine that her father jerks off to pictures of her or to the idea of her in general, because incest is obviously one of like the 4 calling cards of this: incest, piss, periods, and vomit. Those are the things. At this point, the kook is also determining to kill people that had been helping it. So it's going to kill Garth, and it's just attacking different people there. Nadine stays behind and lights the house on fire with a pack of matches and the dynamite, as Mrs. Glover conveniently used to light her one and only cigarette right before this happened. As all of the kids rush out of the house, Nadine is like, I love you, Shelby! And Shelby is like, ah! I also forgot to mention this earlier, but quote, Shelby looked back at her eyes wide with terror, and Nadine wondered how anyone could ever have mistaken her for a boy. She's had such beautiful eyelashes, such perfect mouth. So the only thing, I guess, that defines a female's physicality is eyelashes and the perfect mouth. But we also know that boys typically have longer eyelashes. Anyway, Shelby is obviously crying about what just happened. Also, there's no time to stop as Pastor Eddie turns into a creature and they fight. Quote, fronds and tendrils dripping with clear viscous mucus uncurled as his features opened, skin unsticking itself, features reduced to a random topography of bumps on the thick digits of its grasping orifice, a gaping crotch-like fork where alien muscles met around a puckered anal maw lined with peg-like yellow teeth that clicked together rapidly, shifting in their gums. The kids attack it together, shoot it with a gun. Switch over to Betty, who is dying but crawling away. Her and Athena are both bloody and dying from the explosion. And then we get some trauma dumping about the last time Betty had died when she was 6 years old, and Cheryl's monster comes out and consumes both Betty and Athena. Gabe is flashbacking to when he was being saved so that it can describe his misery more and how the creature feature has pushed him out of the closet, cracked his egg, as you will. Then they're walking along and he's talking about what to say to Shelby since Nadine is dead, and he slips into something about how his feet must be bigger from growing, and his nasty, ugly hair makes him not want to look down at his legs. He's thinking about the last time that he shaved his leg at the same time that he's thinking about how Nadine's body hit the door with that Quote, Brady must have been down there too, and Smith. It hurt to think of Candace, who had blushed so prettily when he smiled at her. He wondered when he would be able to think of himself as a woman, when it would feel anything less than mortifying to think she, instead of letting the leaden weight of he drop from his tongue. He thought of Courtney Love's messy red lipstick and unwashed platinum hair, of her mint green dress and Kurt's hand on a pale, smooth shoulder. And considering Gabe's mom argued with his aunt about how porn might have affected him and who he is, but she didn't care, this just makes it feel like he decided that he liked Candace, knowing that she was a lesbian, but was she really a lesbian because if she was blushing at him? Is that something he was projecting onto her? I don't know, but it almost makes it seem like because a girl liked him, who is probably a lesbian, since it's conversion camp, then Gabe decided that he was a lesbian so that he can get her affections. That's what it feels like. In post, because it wasn't set up, it explains that the explosion happened from Joe's mind reading about the dynamite's location from Malcolm's head. We didn't get any description of this. And while she is explaining this to the other kids apparently don't know and don't understand, even though they're all supposedly mind melted, so they would all theoretically also know about the dynamite thing. They're all still walking, and Shelby's being brain tormented, and the bird is saying, you were jealous of Nadine, weren't you? And you can come back. I still have the bottom half of her, and you can fuck that pussy. It's still intact, and I can make you one anyway. I can make you perfect, girl. Come on back. And I'm guessing that this is the creature, since it's all in italics, which that's not how it's speaking in the rest of the book. So sometimes it's italics and sometimes it's not italics. I mean, maybe this is just Shelby thinking about it in general. Once they lay down somewhere, finally, the voice still bothers Shelby, trying to get her to come and meet it, saying that it is Nadine. Joe is laying with Felix, thinking about how she stabbed another girl when she was out there getting the dynamite, and that was the only purpose of this POV switch, to retcon the bunker situation. Going back to Shelby, she also gets out of bed, gets big sad, gets with John during a kaleidoscope of things, and then mourns Nadine after, mentioning that there's a dead man in the shower. While walking the desert, we're in Joe's perspective, and they travel and see the Cuckoo in the woods, and it says that it has her and that they're thinking about going to go and get her. It's talking again about Nadine. As they travel more, they recognize how convenient that bunker was, and the narrative takes another opportunity to say that Joe started her period and her pants are crusty and smelly, and they determine that they're so desperate that they pee in a canteen in case they need it to drink. They've only been walking for like a day or two. As they continue, John's thinking about how his dad hated his mom for being fat. Quote, Philip Bates said it again, the day that he found John's magazines, all those muscular, sweat-slicked bodies, so unlike John's own. I have been patient with you. Learned to live with the laziness, the lying, the mama's boy theatrics, but I'll be damned if I raise a queer. And now his son realized that he'd just been guilty. He hadn't been able to love her, his soft and round wife with her wavy golden hair and ruddy cheeks, the product falsely advertised by the thin, hollow-cheeked woman in their wedding photos, and he hated that John hadn't minded at all, that his fat wife and his fat son had adored each other, had even sometimes been happy in spite of the cold looming presence of his martyred disapproval. And now, because of his dad, he always finishes the phrase, I love you, with, like a fat kid loves cake. From Gabe's perspective, you think that this author was going to have them pee in a bottle and not make you watch them drink it? Somehow this is also used to help validate Shelby. Quote, they had to drink it, of course. By noon, they were all practically delirious, so dehydrated that they could barely cry. And so when the canteen came around, Gabe tipped it back without hesitation and swallowed a mouthful of acrid piss. It wasn't as bad as he'd feared, really. He'd tasted it before while sucking cock, a little trace of bitterness in the gamey bouquet of an unwashed groin. At least the hunger was easier to bear. It made him feel good, special almost, like he was sacrificing something for the greater good by leaving his unfinished MREs scattered across the desert. Maybe he'd never get a chance to be a girl. Not really. But at least when they found his body out here, his collarbones would be standing out like his prows of a battleship. I'd have to pick a whole new name, he thought. Buy new clothes, hormones somehow, and then what, spend my life savings for someone to cut my thing apart and shove it up inside of me? He tried to make it a hateful thought, a lash of punishment thrown back over his shoulder, but just the idea brought such a wave of relief that he almost stopped in his tracks. That was exactly what he wanted. His whole life he had been creeping along with the weight of his manhood crushing him as flat as a cockroach, dirty and untouchable, even when a lover was inside of him. It was like the minute he'd slipped out of his mother, the doctors caught him in a trash bag full of putrid sludge and tied it off, trapping him inside for the rest of his life. Shelby was a few paces behind him. He'd wondered if she'd felt this way, if she still felt this way. How long did it take to slip out from under their burden and start life as something new? He watched her hips move, her ass swaying from side to side. She looked like a girl, a real one. A sudden spasm of misery cramped his stomach. He would never look like that. Those curves, that hourglass shape, shoulders too broad, hips too narrow, chest too wide. He would be a cheap knockoff of a woman, a slouching scarecrow in garish lipstick and blue eyeshadow. And they keep walking, and he thinks about how much he hates his mother, how much she doesn't want him anyway, how crazy it is that they're all going through this when they were just laying in each other's arms a few hours ago, and how if he went home, he'd just kill himself in the bathtub. Malcolm starts singing, and then all of the other kids start singing too. Gabe eventually drops because he's an anorexic, and they try to move him. John picks him up. They get him going, keep walking, think that they see wolves in the woods, and then we delve into Malcolm just being in his head a lot, trauma dumping again about being abused as he walks, and then jumping from thought to thought. They all get attacked by something while walking. Joe shoots it. It's still chasing them, imitating the voices of people that they know. Then they finally get to a shanty town. It seems like a facade of a town, she says. At least that's what she says, though it doesn't really matter because they don't spend any time here whatsoever. But Grandpa is waiting in a parking lot over here somewhere, so they eventually do get away. And she doesn't tell Grandpa anything. They all load into the car and then just drive off. And then it says once they're at a safe distance, she tells him everything. And then nothing happens. Nothing happens. It's a time skip for 16 years. So this place that had like 60 theoretical kids at it, where we only saw like 7 maybe, exploded in the middle of Utah. None of the parents went investigating. No cops went investigating. Nobody checked it out. Nobody looked for any of these missing kids. None of these kids contacted their families. Literally nothing happened for 16 years. I hate when authors time skip arbitrarily and then it's like the thing happened yesterday. After the time skip, we open on Felix's perspective because out of all of these kids, Felix is the only one that has been chasing after the Cuckoo for all of these years. He's living in his car. Apparently his car is so hot that he can't keep any canned goods in it, otherwise they explode, yet he can still just live in it just fine, whatever. He's been chasing these places around the country, looking at these conversion camps all around the country, looking for the Cuckoo, looking for signs of maybe Mrs. Glover or some of the other things if they survived. I don't know why they think Mrs. Glover might have survived when they left that trail behind. Again, we don't get any sort of information about like what might have happened to tip this off. Also, it gives another expression of, hey, at these camps that Felix is kind of going and checking out, all of the kids are just fucking, and sometimes, often, the counselors are also fucking the kids. Like, grow a little bit of humility, grow a little bit of skill. It's not shocking to constantly talk about rape and children. Like, it is the most baby mindset of a writer to be like, you know what's shocking? Incest and rape. I'm just going to throw it in there casually. Got him. But it looks like Felix's time has finally paid off as he's found where Mrs. Glover is currently. I don't know why it took them so long to find it if she's not moving around all the time. Whatever. Felix says their group fell apart not long after the end of the camp as he tried to stay away from things. It mentions Nadine's parents had a little boy who was too sensitive, played with dolls, and cried when he saw dead things in the road. You know what that means? He's going to become either gay or trans because you can't play with dolls or cry without just being a guy. And that turned into cross-dressing in his sister's clothing and lewd behavior, which lewd behavior in kids is usually a sign of sexual molestation. Let's be honest here. The baby is also relegated to hatred by the author, as it mentions that this is only a trauma baby to help the parents get over Nadine's death. The mother, however, feels like a failure that her kid may be gay or trans and picks a website with misspelled testimonials that is the same camp that she sent her other daughter to, where her daughter died. So mom, super smart, super traumatized that she had to have another baby, is going to send her new baby to the same camp that killed her last baby. Makes total sense. To the same kind of camp that killed her last baby, with the same counselors at the head of it. And so after 16 years, this pretends that there is any sense of urgency in Felix whatsoever to get the gang back together, even though it's like, bro, it's been 16 years. There's no sense of urgency in any of this. Switch over to a new perspective called Laura. Laura is actually Gabe, because Gabe has transitioned into a very successful prostitute that goes by Bunny Vixen. This opens with Laura being at an airport where it seems like she picks up most of her clientele because she focuses on the rich people coming in and out of there. And she's getting hit on by this random guy that she calls probably a finance bro. He's trying to push her to go and do some quickie sex with him, but she doesn't really want to. And then he starts calling her names and swearing at her. And so then she swears back at him and walks away all meanly after they have their little dick measuring throwdown. Quote, "It felt good to leave him standing there, though her stomach roiled at turning her back on him. Men had hit her for less. Her only defense now was an effect that she'd spent years cultivating, from one of breathy vulnerability to a sort of steel-clad cuntiness with a spine of fuck you money. She'd probably made more than a little shit She probably made more than this little shit last fiscal year anyway. Let him hit her. She'd take his beach house and slice off his balls in court." Then she gets a call from Felix saying that he found it and tells Laura where he is, while Laura thinks about if she'll go to meet him. Quote, "She thought of Palm Springs, of lying poolside like a lizard in the sun, a mimosa close in hand, and clients queuing up to smell her dirty panties, to suck her toes, and to drink her piss and beg her to step on their faces and put her cigarettes out on their nipples. Clamps and spankings and ball gags. It was the best job that she'd ever had, the only thing that she'd ever been good at. I'll be there tomorrow." Switching over to Joe, retcon throwbacks to explain that first night after they'd escaped with Grandpa, and Grandpa believed them and then tried to take care of all of these kids on his own. He got a job at Walmart and other places, and it says that he dealt with apparent depressive episodes, tantrums, fights, breakups, suicide attempts, anorexia, and petty theft. With how controlling these parents were to send their kids to gay-away camps, I don't see how they didn't try to find their kids, to investigate what happened to their kids, to investigate the explosion, to see if their kids died in it or what. Grandpa was in retirement, and all these kids did was cause problems for him. But honestly, who cares about the grandpa introduced in this, who is also a piece of shit, who got married and then cheated on his wife the whole time? We don't learn anything about Grandma, by the way, because the women in this just don't matter. The men are all that matter, and the women are just accessories or tools for validation. So she understood that he wanted to bang boys. He wanted to bang his prostitute Yoshi and not her, and that was okay. They could just be married for views. Randomly, TV mentions a mom killing a child that she thought was a replacement of her child, and apparently this is an ongoing issue that hasn't been discussed or discovered or looked into for the last 16 years. All we know is that Shelby and Joe had exes, and it sounds like Shelby tried to kill herself a couple of times throughout everything. And then Joe calls herself a banana for being white on the inside and yellow on the outside, and gets drunk and has sex with Shelby, and then she gets up. Felix calls her, and they've found it. Switch over to John, and we're catching up with him. He thought that he would be skinny when he got older, and describes how he felt like when he became a skinny adult, it would be like aliens shooting out of the chest of him, and he would just be born into something else. He's kind of resentful that he is not skinny, but he's gotten over it. When he gets the call from Felix that it's been found, he freaks out. His transgender girlfriend breaks up with him because she thinks that he's crazy. Then he wonders why the Cuckoo only goes after gays. We'll get an answer to that later. Will it make sense? No. He wonders why it targeted them, where did it go, and why wasn't it hunting them down when they have been just latent this entire time, because it clearly knows where they are. It's still in their heads, right? I'd just like to say the author acknowledging their own plot holes does not erase the plot holes. Immediately after saying that it targets gays, the narrator of this book says that the monster could be anyone, anywhere, at any time. So it's not targeting gays. Arbitrarily, it goes through a bunch of events that happened between 1995 and 2011, including 9/11, which the author has praised Osama bin Laden for on social media. I just thought you might want that little tidbit. Then Felix thinks about some person named Abigail and how someone else named Louise is gone and buys a ticket. So Louise is the transgender girlfriend, and Abby is the little brother of Nadine, but their chosen name for being trans. How they all already know about Abigail. Abigail doesn't matter in this, by the way. Switch over to Malcolm to catch up with him. And for the record, this book just starts calling Malcolm Mal in the same way that it just starts calling Gabe Laura, and you have to figure it out. It looks like in the time since the camp, he's become a they. Can't help but notice that this book is basically saying that trauma makes you gay or trans. Malcolm gets into a fight with his female to male partner, Charlie, about Malcolm going to meet his friends and do this thing. And because he's been absent in his relationship and lies to Charlie and uses Charlie, and Malcolm says that they need to help Abby/Nadine's sibling who was sent off to conversion therapy camp. Charlie apparently hits Malcolm, so they're both abusive in this. Shouldn't be together, just break up. And Charlie mocks Malcolm for being a pansy. As Malcolm walks down the street with Charlie tossing his paintings out the window because they've been fighting with each other, everyone in California is apparently making fun of the two in this lesbian couple because all Malcolm had to do was take hormones, and now his body is just completely androgynous where he looks like a female. Switching back over to where Joe and Shelby are, Shelby is having dreams of having sex with the girl when one of her moms is shoving a bloody cloth inside of her for another period reference, and then she wakes up with Joe next to her. Shelby goes outside, smokes, drinks by the pool, and waits for Felix to show up, and Joe gets up while she thinks about all of the nightmares and suicide attempts and hopelessness that they've all gone through that Joe was there for because Shelby stayed with Joe and her grandpa the longest. All of the cast have agreed to gather at this restaurant to catch up, and they just start talking. In case you want a summary of where they all are, Nadine is dead. Felix is a poor schmuck that lives in his car, browses the dark webs and gets until he gets arrested and can't keep canned food in his car. Joe is mostly helpless, can't hold down a job, and her grandpa recently died, so she lives all alone and is barely even getting by with that. Shelby had what she referred to as a Jessica Rabbit boob job and is in on and off again relationships, kind of sleeps around, kind of does open relationships for the last 16 years, and sometimes sleeps with Joe out of pity because Joe has nothing left. She also tried to kill herself a couple of times. John is in on and off relationships, currently dating a trans woman named Lewis, while he resents never turning into a skinny person. Also, he can't hold down a job. Malcolm has decided to become a they and started taking hormones that gave him amazing curves that just magically made him super androgynous, and is dating a physically abusive trans man and is a failed artist that even California makes fun of. And then the most successful of them all is anorexic Gabe, who became a trans woman prostitute named Bunny Vixen, and she is making a top dollar. So analyze that outcome as you will. They talk about that night forever ago where blood was taken from them, and now they claim that that blood was taken from them to do testing for club drugs, which makes no sense when they found receipts for drugs and they were all being drugged through the food there. Like, then they were thrown down to the monster to be eaten by the monster while they were all on drugs. They all agree that they got to go and do this, take care of this monster once and for all. They get into Felix's car, which the trunk is full of so many guns and medical kits, grenades, automatics, which, you know, are generally outlawed in the United States and have been for decades, but of course, don't worry about it. Also, Felix drives an Impala. Let me know if you think that there's some kind of supernatural fan stereotype going on right there. We get a long chapter from Betty's perspective for some reason. There's trauma dumping, then remembering having sex with 16-year-old Athena, and then toppling to the ground in pain with a feeling of a dozen periods and vomiting a few times. A wormy thing comes out of her and she feels better and then beats the guy that she's with as the thing in her head says that she's going to need to bring meat for whatever it is that she is doing. She brings the body to this nonsense random house, quote, "It was smotheringly hot inside of the stranger's house, the air close and humid and full of the sound of running water. It smelled of warm root beer and diarrhea. He took her jacket and led her from the mud room with its coat and scarves hanging from wooden pegs over ranks of winter boots and out into the kitchen where his family was waiting, an older man and woman. They must have been the original parents, and two younger women, early 20s, maybe all blonde and blue-eyed. They knelt naked on peeling linoleum where the kitchen table should have been, leaning together to form a sort of shelter. Where their skin touched, it was scabbed and warted, growing together so that the head and the shoulders all formed part of the same flaking, oozing clot. Fingers twitched at the ends of their limbed arms. Piss stains marred the floor as the exposed particle boards where the synthetic tile had separated. A few of their eyes followed Betty as she passed, but mostly they stared dead and milky into space. "They'll be ready very soon now," said the stranger. "Have you seen the chrysalis before?" I don't know what this is, and it's never mentioned the chrysalis before, and it's never going to mention the chrysalis again, which just makes me feel like, this book ran out of ideas and had no idea where to go, and was like, screw it. Switch over to another flashback sex scene with Athena and Betty, and of course during her period, I hope you guessed that. And then she comes back from the memory when she thinks about the smells of Athena, including the menstrual blood, and why do people think girls' bathrooms are clean? And then she smiles because she won't be alone anymore for long. The man is taken by the creature, whatever it is, and just says tendrils and cuckoo. None of this matters or makes any sense. Betty is just doing the bidding of the cuck. Give us a section where it says they're everywhere, in all places, doing a lot of different things, proving that it's not just the gays that are being gone after. It's inside of military bases, it's inside of suburbs, it's inside of everywhere, going after everything. It could be anyone. Quote, "In a home, it could draw the blinds, lock the doors, and do its work in private. It could spread from flesh to flesh, not in the careful ways with which it made its cutting in the desert, but through the crude assimilation and replication. A boy went to sleep one night, and the next day a thing wore his face to school. It was a miracle of modern life. The insular nature of the home, work, church, education, could all be satisfied with only the most trivial investment of energy. It let relationships wither. It fell away from the extended family, allowed its cutting memberships in clubs and in societies to taper off to nothing, and slowly, meticulously, it created streets in the neighborhoods, then entire counties, ruled by a dark and watchful silence." How this makes any sense, I don't know, because the whole thing is trying to, later explains that it is just trying to consume everything. So you would think that it would take this person's identity and then go back to all of its responsibilities so that it could spread, so that it could consume more. Not do this. But it feels to me, when I'm looking at the elements, that the author hadn't fully decided which way they wanted to go with this. And so they just started inserting creepy elements from a lot of different places, trying to copy a lot of different things without actually determining the why somebody does something and how they go about doing it in order to feed that desire. Because they just wanted to be creepy. They wanted to be gross. They wanted to be weird. So they didn't come up with the logic that makes something scary. They just went gross and then saw the successful elements of other horror stories and was like, let me just shove that in here and it'll be the same thing. Spoiler alert, it's not. Then it says over the last 16 years, it spread to all of these different communities and it spread all over the place. But one of the places that it hadn't yet spread yet was the community that Malcolm lives in for some reason. Somehow, even though it's like a straight shot to get to Chico, California from Utah, but whatever. There is a person in his building, though, that is connected to the Cuckoo, that connects it to Betty. So then Betty shows up to wait outside Malcolm's house. Is that going to come into play? No, it's not. It's never going to come into play, actually. I think Betty just kind of sits there and then later shows up when they go to kill the motherboard. In the car again with Felix and the crew. They're driving along, preparing for the fight. Lots of money is there. Felix feels like garbage standing next to Laura because Laura is just so beautiful. And what the frick is Felix? He's a short little loser that's ugly, that's alone, that has nothing. And look at how perfect Laura is. Shelby says that she doesn't want to do this and apologizes to Felix for making him do this on his own all of this time. She kisses his hands. And by the way, I forgot to mention earlier, but some part in this book said that they all promised to love Shelby more than anybody else in the group. I don't know why, other than Shelby as a possible author insert, but discuss that at your own leisure. For some reason, they decide that they need to go to Laura's house to defeat the thing at Laura's house. I'm going to assume that there is some missing context. Either I just had an aneurysm and forgot it as to why they're going there, or it didn't make it into the book and the author didn't realize it and the publisher and the editors didn't realize it. But part of me thinks that they needed to go to Laura's house specifically to kill the Gabe doppelganger that's there for some reason or another, because that's all that they do. They just sneak into his house, fight this thing without a problem, mind you. So they were all overpowered before, and maybe it's because they're adults with guns now. I don't know. Who knew that to defeat an all-consuming eldritch alien creature thing, you just needed guns and dynamite? So they just go into the house, and then they fight it, and then they burn the house down, and that kills it, and then they move on. And once they leave Gabe's house, they stop at this hotel for the night, and then they kind of just hang out. They're eating. They're on their way to Mrs. Glover's, actually, but they just needed a rest. Malcolm gets upset at being told to not use a card when he's going out to get a snack from the vending machine, because he's like, stop treating me like a baby. And then he goes out into the hallway, and he's looking at his phone. Charlie is upset at him for being gone, and he's angsting that no one wants him, and he's considered weird at work for being a vegan. And then he says that he is borderline and has had trouble finding a doctor that'll work with him, that white women doctors, psychologists always just, shrugged him off or like whatever. And then he found one black psychologist that actually spent time with him to understand him, but he had to stop seeing him. He says that he's looking at the text messages from Charlie again, and Charlie is threatening to kill himself. And then John comes out to check on Malcolm, and Malcolm is like, please help me. So John takes the phone and takes the SIM card and cracks the SIM card. And then Malcolm apologizes to John for ever being mean to him and asks if they have a chance against the alien. John talks about how I think it wanted to stay hidden. That's why it's worked secretly the way that it has. And it targeted us queers because nobody listens to queers. But again, it doesn't just target them. This book also said that nobody was listening to the Doomsdayers either, but I don't see a Doomsdayers conversion camp. The guys go back into the hotel room. Laura has a bad dream and then wakes up from it, where the main cast then runs out of the building because they need to go, because they feel, I think that's because the bad dream is a sign that the Cuckoo is coming. So they're like, we gotta go. And they get into the car downstairs, and the hotel lights up on fire. And they drive for a while. There's a random old lady with a pistol running out of one of the rooms over there. I don't know. They flee the scene so fast it doesn't even matter, until eventually they stop, and Felix is smacking the crap out of Malcolm for being an idiot for using a phone with a SIM card. But I thought that they said that the beast wasn't looking for them because it didn't matter. And then we're going to find later that they're in this town full of mind-controlled creatures, and they're like, it is standing down. It does want us to be there. So then why in this scene are they like, oh, we need to hide from these creatures? I think it's more likely that you're going to be hunted down by the feds because you're lighting fires up and killing people everywhere that you go right now, and you look insane. Once they deal with that, Felix tells Malcolm that he's a selfish, codependent bitch, and that's why people are dead. There's more random exposition dumping, repeat that they're all going to die soon. When they go to sleep, Felix is thinking about that first time that he had sex, which was in the bunker forever ago when he was between Malcolm and John and had a threesome. Graphic detail in passing, and it kind of makes me think of how Tyler Durden would take reels of movies and then just insert random frames of sex, because that's what the narrative is in this book. It's like Gretchen will be having a scene happen and then random long sentence of descriptive sex and then move on, and it's just like, why? Felix thinks about how much he misses that, and if he dies, nobody will miss him. And truth be told, probably, because for the last 16 years, he's been alone in his car, and at the end of this book, he will be alone in the woods. So analyze that how you will. Joe and Shelby then tried having sex for a while, but gave up because the ground was too uncomfortable. And then Joe thinks about her family and feeling alone, and how being reunited with them might feel good, but there's probably a creature over there that is taking her position and being exactly what they want it to be. We then find John and Malcolm getting it on, and Felix gets out of the car, and it only says that, but I don't know if that means that he joined them or what. Shelby and Joe fall asleep after saying I love you together. Laura is then wandering around thinking about life being depressing and hears something in the woods and then lays down with Felix and Malcolm. Felix is then practicing shooting and prepping for the battle, thinking about how people are dead now because they all went along with this. The motel man, the motel in general. Yeah, people are dead, and so are a bunch of kids that then died at the camp, and none of you are thinking about all of the kids that you killed at the camp. Oh, and then Abby is randomly mentioned because they're like, we have to possibly see if we can get Abby out of that camp, because we can't let bad things happen to Abby like happened to Nadine. We just can't. They get to Cook Canyon, which is like a little town somewhere, like the camp. I'm wondering if this is the same place, like Camp Revolution, but I'm not entirely sure because there's a little township around that too. Things aren't looking good, but it's okay. Laura says that she can feel the people being all right, and unfortunately, as they go, they aren't being attacked. Because wouldn't you have it, Felix was right. For no reason at all, the monster wants them alive until suddenly, eventually, it doesn't. They attack the alien-possessed cop, and we get, quote, "It only cares about staying hidden," Felix had said. "It's not a hunter. It's not a soldier. I don't think it has any real firepower, nothing that would draw attention, and most of what it knows about us, it learned from children it's taken. It might know that we're coming, but it has no idea what kind of shit an American can buy at a gun show." You can't get automatic guns generally at a gun show. Or grenades. But okay. They take down this creature without any difficulty. Apparently all they needed was guns, and then start fires all over the place, shooting more people. So these creatures now want them, and they're also being chased by people. Malcolm and Joe go against some dude with some guns, and those guys open fire on Joe and Malcolm, while Laura and Felix and there's a third person, Shelby, all go towards the house to where Miss Glover is. How they know where Miss Glover is, I don't really know. I'm kind of confused on the setting of this, if I'm honest. Once they get to the house, they go upstairs and they find Mrs. Glover laying in a bed, really decrepit, not really moving like a normal person. You'd think if Mrs. Glover was connected to the Cuckoo, then there would be some sort of healing property, because it body snatches. So you'd think that Mrs. Glover might be maintaining a youth or something in order to continue to feed to this creature because she is this creature's servant. But no, she's an old lady, decrepit, laying in a bed with a servant that is there, not a servant, with a caregiver. Both of them get shot. All you need to know right now with Malcolm, Joe, and John is that they're recklessly driving a car around the town, attacking mobs of people, and also being attacked by mobs of people mixed with monsters. And Joe is going to die as she gets shot in the throat for taking care of these guys, but it's okay. Don't worry about it. She was one of the people that this book just didn't like. Going over to Laura's POV as they escape from the house that Mrs. Glover is in, they run into the cuck. Quote, "The Cuckoo dragged its raw, slimy bulk through the ark, sprouting new limbs to brace itself against the stone. It slobbered and shrieked as it came, its unintelligible cries overlapping wetly as mouths formed, bubbled, and burst on pseudopods and nodding skill-draped skulls like sped-up footage of necrosis in action. Features Laura still recognized even 15 years later. Dana's nose, an unmistakable point, the plumpy, pouty lips of a girl whose name she had never been able to remember, Celine's big, bulging eyes, pruny, soft-nailed fingers groping blindly from the sides of the watered throats as vaginal slits discharged thick streams of yellowish slime. At the center of its thrusting foremost segment, a black oval of chitin, like a caterpillar's head, gazed eyelessly out at them, mouth parts moving like inscrutable machinery. More little limbs formed and collapsed as it pulled itself toward them. It reared up, a bloated serpentine arched, dotted with grasping cilia and filmy eyes, rolled off slack flesh, bunching where its bulk overlapped, dirty feathers bursting from its bedraggled, stunt wings. A bloom of fronds and tendrils erupted from its back all at once, bioluminescence flashing among rags of filmy skin torn by its transformation. The air seemed to flex and throb. It fixed its empty stare on Laura. Some long literal nonsense about how it's consumed and regurgitates everything. It goes on for way too long, trying to show off the gross brilliance of a 12-year-old boy, and it ends up being entirely meaningless. The point being, it's a cosmic entity that only lives to consume as much as it can across the entire galaxy. Looks like the cuck eats Laura, which is fine because Laura shoved her pockets full of ketamine so that when it eats it, it's going to die from an overdose. Malcolm is running from some random dude in the zombie crowd. Shelby and Felix are fleeing this scene as, Laura gets consumed, and we got this sense of victimhood that can't be forgotten. Quote, "They'd made a mistake. They fought back against the They fought back against the way the world worked, tried to snatch a queer kid from the jaws of its cruel indifference, and they were going to die for it. Shelby holds Felix while Laura makes the thing sick with the ketamine. The thing absorbs Felix, turns into its dad, kisses him for one last gift of incest. Betty goes in to kill Malcolm. Laura's inside of the cuck and thinking about her sister as she breaks its mind with her mind. The thing is defeated. Laura's legs were eaten by the thing, and she is going to eventually die. Don't worry about it. Felix is missing a hand, but Shelby and Felix still pick up Laura's torso and carry her out of there to try to save her. Betty is now dead, since the big bad monster is dead and was so easily killed, and it was the brainworm of everything. All of the other baddies just kind of collapse, and then you can randomly go to get Abby from this fenced-in camp in the desert because Club Revolution is in the same place as it always was and looks the same. Why was that not where Grandma Glover was? I don't know. I'm so confused of the layout in this whole thing. And when Shelby goes to save Abby and is like, hey, you should come with us, Abby is like, why are you doing this for me? And they're like, I knew Nadine. I knew your sister. As if this child ever knew Nadine. And did the parents even talk to this child about Nadine, or was Nadine like a shame on the family because Nadine went away to this camp and then died? Anyway, it doesn't matter. Then we skip to what is probably basically an epilogue going into 2018. It ends with Abby going to a pride march in California, now transitioned from male to female, being checked out by cis dyke lesbians over on the sidewalk, and she has a male to female girlfriend. Laura and Joe are confirmed dead. Shelby, Felix, Malcolm, and John all raised Abby. Shelby has a new girlfriend. John and Malcolm are together. Felix lives alone in the woods by himself, and to be cliche, it ends with Abby randomly seeing somebody in a group and complaining that you never know who is us or who is them. And that's the story. You're welcome. So getting into my final thoughts about this story, we're gonna have some comments, some spice probably in here. Number one, a list of trauma is not a story, and I'm really sick of authors that lean on just listing trauma, just doing exposition dumps of trauma, that just think torturing a character is a story. I don't think it's a story, but especially when it's poorly done, as opposed to just having stuff happen throughout the story and to see the effect of that trauma on the person. Not a story to exposit to me what your character has gone through. This doesn't even seem like it tried to build the friendship between the characters. They hardly had any scenes together before they decided that they were friends, and even then it just rushed through things. And I think especially because it was trying to be like, look, I'm like it. But it was so short because it is an epically long story that takes its time to develop the characters. But I don't get a sense that this author understands character development by the way that this is written, by the way that Manhunt was written, and by the way that characters are just half-assed. If even half-assed, it might be friggin' eighth-assed. I failed to see how doing house chores or working outside is supposed to make somebody less gay. Can somebody inform me on that? I would also like to comment that pee-pee poo-poo is not scary. It's not gross. You're an untalented 8-year-old trying to shock your mom. Sorry. That might be a little harsh, but I took out some of my other harsher comments, so I think you can deal with that. There's literally no plot in this book. It doesn't even try. There's no story. The kids aren't motivated. The kids aren't doing anything. The kids aren't even like, survive. It's just... And then it's solved whenever the author decides to solve it, which was the dynamite and the random burning things. Nothing built into anything else. It was all just convenient. So you couldn't really follow the characters doing things, making decisions, root for them, because whenever anything felt right, the author was going to change it. Totally unrelated beyond just mentioning it, since I didn't mention it earlier, but I feel like there is a certain kind of author that likes to use the word anus. I don't see it often, and when I do, it's very specific. Like, his name was Augustin also brought attention to the anus clenching. Tell me what you think about that. This book mentioned the word fat at least 140 times, which made it more of a fat camp than a Jesus camp. The POV switching in this story didn't really make any sense. There was a nonsensical choice of the ordering. I don't think there was any ordering. Some of the scenes were just to let characters masturbate or have sex or to correct the record of something that happened, 20 pages ago. I understand how this is supposed to be horrible because it's a conversion camp, but I fail to understand how this is supposed to convert anybody. It just feels like a hate boner fiction but not actually anything of substance. Hope against hope was used twice in this book. That's just a bad phrase. A big portion of it is character development, and it is facing fears. And a big theme of it, the book, has to do with growing up and facing your fears growing up. There is a reason for the choices that are done in that book and for what the monster is and what the monster represents. In this, there is nothing. What does the monster represent? Nothing. What is the monster doing? Nothing. How does the cuckoo relate to the knockoff Stranger Things earlier? Nothing. I don't think that this author actually thought through the choices, the themes, what it was. And instead, just like the spookiness and or the valor that is Stephen King, and then tried to slap it on their own book to steal that valor from a better author. And it feels so fake. It feels so forced, and it feels disrespectful. This was given a starred review by Publishers Weekly on I Need You to Explain Yourself. You don't have to, but I'm asking. This was also published by Tor Nightfire, which is a big publisher. I generally have more questions. Like, if something is a mess and it's self-published, I'm like, fine, you were probably on your own. Very likely you were on your own. But this was not that situation. Something that really bothered me throughout the story is that Jo was arbitrarily Japanese. And so every time she referred to her grandpa, she either said Oji or sometimes she said Oji-chan, but usually it was Oji with one I. And then sometimes when she referred to her grandma, which wasn't often, it was Oba, and like one time it was Oba-chan. But if you look at the romanji of those are not accurate representations for grandma or grandpa. And I don't think anybody did their due diligence with this to correctly translate Oji or Oba with romanji. And so it ended up saying aunt and uncle the entire time instead of grandma and grandpa. And we didn't learn that it was grandma and grandpa until some other time when she said retirement home and grandpa instead of Oji and Oba. So it just felt like the author wearing this as a costume on the characters didn't care enough about the characters, and it's just a further thing. The author couldn't bother to look into conversion therapy camp and then to put the actual outfit of conversion therapy camp on this, to have any of the camp counselors utter the name Jesus. So then why the heck would we even bother to understand the Japanese language that we're going to thrust on this character? Because the characters didn't matter. The characters were obviously just tokens to be used for either specific points or to eventually murder. There is no tension with anything because the baddies aren't ever around when they should be. There's no sneaking around in the camp because the baddies aren't there when they should be there. There's no hiding. There's no sneaking around. And again, so then the punishments, like when Nadine getting spanked, it was only because the author wanted it to happen when there were never any bad guys monitoring what any of these kids were doing. Every character in this book also sounds exactly the same, as though the author is unable to empathize with anyone and every character has to be their voice. I ask what the prologue had to do with the rest of this book. None of it did. The prologue promised a story that the rest of this book was not. Side note for other authors, multiple POVs is not your friend if you have no good reason to do it. My recommendation is to sort of think through your choices, why you're doing what, when, and how it affects or helps your narrative and your story. Again, I don't understand the time jump in this story. It made no sense. It was arbitrary. It showed no value to them immediately picking up where they left off and taking it 16 years later. It reminded me again of Grady Hendrix in the vampire book club, where they skipped 3 years into the future, and it was like Patty tried to kill herself 2 weeks ago. If the time skip is not going to actually show progress of something, I would recommend against using it, because this just made them all look stupid. And it really just felt like it was there so that Gabe could transition, Malcolm could transition, Shelby could get further along in her transition. But there was no point, because what'd the alien do for 16 years? Oh, still weak. Oh, Mrs. Glover, basically a comatose patient. So get ready for the spicy question. Does it count as the only conversion therapy in this book that Nadine fell for Shelby when Shelby had a buzzed head and was presenting as male the entire time, going by Andrew because they were at this camp? While some people might be pissy at this question, I also feel like it's insanely disrespectful to have a fully male presenting character who is physically male while looking like a male, and then having one of your main lesbian characters be like, yep, that's a woman. It feels very disrespectful. But you let me know what you think. I already know that kind of question can get me in trouble with certain kinds of people, and at this point, It's just fear to not ask questions. What really got me is all of the comments saying, like Stephen King's It, even in the reviews. And it just feels like a BS attempt to wrap someone else's valor on your POS low-effort garbage. This book is an insult that spits on Stephen King for daring to pretend it has anything to do with him or his writing and to try to sell itself as being related. It also shows the author's inability to understand the themes of it, as that boils down to just gross humor, murder, and fetish sex. The book My Dark Vanessa actually had more Stephen King flourishes on it than this, and that's partially due to the fact that Stephen King was a beta reader for My Dark Vanessa, and so you can see elements of his voice and style affecting that. And also, I have to ask in general, because this book also won a Lambda Award, which is like an award for one of the best books by LGBT people with LGBT stories. Is this really the best that a certain group of identity can do? Is this is the best that deserves the award? If it is, that's a yikes for me. Like, imagine what it means when a book like this gets the award for being the best. And they mean it. With that said, those are my thoughts on this book. Let me know yours in the comments down below. Have you read this book? Will you read this book? What do you think of the story? What do you think of the similarities and the comparisons with it? Do you think there are other more accurate things? Do you think that the story is well laid out? Deep characters, deep grossness? Are you spooked? Let me know. Looking forward to the conversation. With that said, have a great weekend and don't die.
Was that Wayland Cross in the trunk? Do you know, or is that something that's still being figured out?
The person in the trunk was not Wayland Cross.
Is he in trouble?
We don't know who did it, but as the owner of the car, the longer he's missing, the worse it looks for him.
Cross isn't a killer. For the last couple of years, the average number of murders in Baltimore has been over 300, and it's been going up. Mind you, that's only whatever the badges count as official murder, and believe me, there are people that don't count when they die. Wayland? If you're down here, tell me. I'm not talking to the badges, I've been looking for you. They found a body in your trunk. Why? Did you do that? To the left, plain black letters read along the wall. You walked in the corridor. Once that ends, you chose the dark is on the right. My vision goes blurry, flickers black and black and black for longer intervals until I can't see anything at all. I'm not screaming anymore, but my voice echoes back to me. Where the hell am I? You're dead, Josephine. Even smart people do stupid shit sometimes, right?